Set. Welcome to soft mystic stories long before the pyramids rose over the Nile, before Greece built its marble temples, and before Rome imagined itself eternal. There were already cities standing in the hot river plains of southern Mesopotamia. They were not large by later standards. Their streets were narrow, their houses made from mud brick, and their temples rose only modestly above the flat landscape. Yet to the people who lived there, these were the first true centers of civilization. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always enjoy picturing where everyone is settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was difficult, unpredictable, and often cruel. Floods could nourish the soil one year and destroy entire communities the next. Rain was scarce. Summer heat could become unbearable. Survival depended on canals, careful planning, and constant labor. Out of that difficult world emerged the first city-states of Sumer, and with them emerged some of humanity's oldest recorded gods. Among those gods were beings known as the Anunnaki. Their name has fascinated people for generations. In modern times, it has been surrounded by myths, speculation, and strange theories. But for the people of ancient Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were not mysterious visitors from another world. They were the divine powers that stood behind the world itself. They represented the structure of heaven, the order of kingship, the fate of cities, and the invisible forces that governed life. The word Anunnaki is usually understood to mean offspring of Anu, or those of royal blood. Anu was the great sky god, the distant ruler of the heavens. He was imagined as existing far, above the earth, beyond the reach of ordinary men and women. He was not the kind of god people expected to see walking through cities or speaking directly to kings. Instead, he was the supreme authority of the cosmos, the source from which divine power flowed. Below him were other gods who managed the daily workings of the universe. They controlled rivers, storms, fertility, war, wisdom, love, death, and kingship. Together they formed a divine family and a divine government. The Anunnaki were often described as members of that heavenly court. To understand why these gods mattered so much, it helps to understand the world in which they appeared. Southern Mesopotamia was unlike Egypt. Egypt had a single great river, regular flooding, and natural borders that protected it from invasion. Mesopotamia had none of those advantages. It was an open land vulnerable to raids and conflict. Its rivers flooded unpredictably. Communities had to cooperate constantly just to survive. That need for cooperation shaped everything. Villages grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. Irrigation canals connected settlements across the plain. Temples became centers of storage, labor, trade, and religion. Priests kept records of grain, livestock, and workers. Over time, those records became one of humanity's greatest inventions, writing. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia did not begin with poetry or history. It began with accounting. Temple administrators needed a way to track barley, sheep, oil, beer, and labor. Small clay tablets were pressed with symbols to record goods and transactions. Those symbols gradually evolved into an ununiform, the wedge-shaped writing system that would preserve the stories of Mesopotamia for thousands of years. Because temples controlled so much of daily life, religion and government were deeply connected. The gods were not distant figures who existed only in myths. They were believed to be active rulers of the city. Each city belonged to a particular god. Eridu, one of the oldest cities in southern Mesopotamia, belonged to Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. Uruk belonged to Inanna, the powerful goddess of love, war, and kingship. Nippur belonged to Enlil, the storm god, who would become one of the most important figures in Mesopotamian religion. Belonged to the moon god, Nana. The city itself was often seen as the earthly property of its divine patron. Its fields, walls, canals, and people existed under the protection of that god. Kings did not rule because they were elected by the people. They ruled because the gods allowed them to rule. This idea appears again and again in Mesopotamian texts. One of the oldest surviving traditions from Sumer says that kingship descended from heaven. To modern ears, that may sound symbolic, but to the people of ancient Mesopotamia, it was literal truth. Political authority did not come from military power alone. It came from the divine world. A king who lost a battle might claim the gods had abandoned him. A city destroyed by war might believe its patron god had withdrawn protection. When rulers built temples, they were not simply creating monuments. They were maintaining the relationship between heaven and earth. The temple stood at the center of this relationship. In the earliest cities, temples were often built on raised platforms above the surrounding settlement. Over time, these structures became larger and more impressive, eventually developing into step towers known as ziggurats. The ziggurat was not simply a building. It was a symbolic mountain rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain. Its height represented the connection between the world of men and the world of the gods. At the top of the structure, there was often a sacred shrine where the deity was believed to dwell. Priests climbed the stairways carrying offerings, incense, and ritual objects. From below, ordinary people could look up and see the house of their god towering over the city skyline. One of the most famous early religious centers was Eridu. Ancient Mesopotamians believed Eridu was the first city ever created. According to tradition, it was founded by the gods themselves. Eridu was associated with Enki, known later in Odeon as Aya. Enki was one of the most beloved gods of Mesopotamia. Unlike the distant Anu or the stern Enlil, Enki was clever, practical, and often compassionate toward humanity. He ruled over the fresh waters beneath the earth called the Abzu. These waters were believed to nourish rivers, springs, and life itself. Enki's temple at Eridu became one of the oldest religious sites in the world. Archaeologists have found layer after layer of temples built on the same sacred location, suggesting that worship continued there for centuries. Each generation rebuilt the shrine, larger than before, preserving the same holy space. That continuity mattered deeply to Mesopotamians. They believed the gods had established order at the beginning of time, and human beings had a duty to preserve that order. The Anunnaki played a major role in that idea of order. They were often imagined as a divine assembly, a council of gods who gathered together to decide the fate of the world. Some texts describe them sitting in judgment, deciding destinies, approving kingship, or determining punishment. In later traditions, the Anunnaki were sometimes linked to the underworld as judges of the dead. But in the earliest Sumerian context, they were more closely associated with the highest ranks of the divine world. The idea of a divine council reflected the political realities of Mesopotamian life. Just as cities were governed by assemblies, kings, priests, and officials, the heavens were imagined as having their own government. There was hierarchy, there was rank, there was law. The universe was not random. That belief gave people comfort in an uncertain world. Floods, droughts, invasions, and disease could strike without warning. But behind those events, there was believed to be divine intention. If disaster came, perhaps the gods were angry. If crops were abundant, perhaps the gods were pleased. If a city prospered, perhaps its patron deity had granted favor. The earliest myths of Mesopotamia reveal how strongly people believed in that connection between divine will and earthly life. In one tradition, the gods divided the cosmos into different realms. Anu ruled the heavens, Enlil ruled the earth and the air between heaven and earth, Enki ruled the watery depths below. This division was more than a family arrangement. It explained how the universe itself functioned. The heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the waters below formed the structure of existence. The Anunnaki operated within that cosmic order. They were not all powerful in the way later monotheistic religions imagined God. Mesopotamian gods had rivalries, emotions, and weaknesses. They could be jealous, proud, compassionate, or cruel. They argued with one another. They formed alliances. They could even make mistakes. That made them feel strangely human. At the same time, they remained terrifyingly powerful. A single divine decision could destroy a city, flood a plain, or place a king on the throne. To live in Mesopotamia was to live in constant awareness of that unseen power. People offered food, beer, animals, music, prayers, and incense to maintain divine favor. Priests watched the skies for signs. Divers studied the livers of sacrificed animals. Astronomers observed the stars. Everything in the world could contain a message from the gods. Even the shape of the landscape reinforced this belief. Mesopotamia had few natural mountains, so the ziggurats became artificial mountains, linking earth and heaven. The rivers themselves were seen as gifts from the divine world. Fertile fields depended on water controlled by gods like Enki and Enlil. Nothing important happened without divine involvement. For that reason, The first civilizations did not see religion as separate from politics, economics, or daily life. Religion was daily life. The Anunnaki stood at the center of that world. They represented the invisible order holding civilization together. Without them, there would be no kingship, no law, no harvest, no victory and war, and no explanation for suffering. As Mesopotamian civilization grew larger and more complex, the stories of these gods would grow more complex as well. New cities would rise, new empires would appear, old gods would gain new powers, rival kingdoms would reshape religion for political purposes. But in the beginning, before Babylon, before Assyria, before the great empires of the ancient Near East, there was simply the river plain, the first cities, the first temples, and the belief that somewhere above the world there existed a great divine court. It was there, in those earliest sacred cities of mud, brick, and reeds, that the Anunnaki first entered human history. The distinction between Anunnaki and other divine categories becomes apparent through careful analysis of theological terminology. The Agi, whose name derives from a root meaning to see or to watch, represented a separate class of deities associated with celestial observation and astronomical phenomena. While the Anunnaki governed fundamental cosmic principles, the Agi served more specialized functions related to divination and the interpretation of heavenly signs. Sumerian texts consistently maintain this distinction, with the Agi appearing as subordinate to the Anunnaki in matters of ultimate authority. Picture the night sky over ancient Europe, where priests trained in the arts of the Agi scanned the heavens for omens, their observations feeding into the greater decisions of the Anunnaki council below. The seven who decree fate constituted another distinct divine category, though one closely associated with the Anunnaki hierarchy. These seven deities possess specific responsibility for determining individual and collective destinies, operating as an executive council within the larger Anunnaki assembly. The number 7 held particular significance in Mesopotamian cosmology, reflecting the 7 visible planets and the 7-day week that structured both divine and human temporal experience. In temple rituals, this sacred number echoed through chants and offerings, reminding worshippers that fate itself was not random, but carefully measured by divine hands. Linguistic analysis reveals the evolution of Anunnaki terminology across different periods and regions of Mesopotamia. Early Sumerian texts employ various spellings and grammatical constructions that suggest dialectical variations in how different city-states understood these deities. The Far period texts show standardization beginning to emerge as political unification created pressure for theological consistency across Sumerian territories. Scribes labored to harmonize these variations, much like diplomats forging alliances, ensuring that the divine order mirrored the growing unity of human cities. The relationship between Anunnaki and cosmic geography becomes evident through examination of temple architecture and ritual practice. Ziggurats, the massive step towers that dominated Mesopotamian cities, served as physical representations of the cosmic mountain where heaven and earth intersected. These structures provided platforms for Anunnaki worship and symbolized the divine hierarchy through their ascending levels. The Anu Ziggurat at Uruk, dedicated to the father of the Anunnaki, exemplifies this architectural theology through its imposing height and careful astronomical alignments. Climbing its weathered steps today, one can still feel the ancient intention. Each level a step closer to the realm where the great gods deliberated. Religious calendars preserved in ununiform archives demonstrate how Anunnaki worship structured the annual cycle of festivals and observances. The Akitu celebration documented from the earliest Sumerian period through the end of Mesopotamian civilization centered on the renewal of divine kingship through Anunnaki approval. During this festival, the reigning monarch underwent ritual procedures that symbolically recreated the original divine appointment of earthly rulers. The streets would fill with processions, music, and sacred drama. As the entire city participated in reaffirming the cosmic contract between gods and humans, the economic dimensions of Anunnaki worship emerged clearly from temple administrative records. These institutions controlled vast agricultural estates, craft workshops, and trade networks that generated the wealth necessary to support elaborate ritual cycles. The DRAM archive, dating to the Earth period, records thousands of animals sacrificed to various Anunnaki throughout the year, indicating the massive scale of resources devoted to maintaining divine favor. One can envision the bustling temple yards alive, with the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. Each animal a tangible set, offering that sustained the invisible order of the universe. Iconographic evidence from cylinder seals and temple reliefs provides visual documentation of how Mesopotamians conceived Anunnaki appearance. Attributes. These deities typically appear wearing horned crowns that signify divine status, with a number of horn pairs indicating relative rank within the celestial hierarchy. Their garments show the elaborate textiles associated with royal authority, while their poses convey the dignified bearing appropriate to cosmic rulers. Rolling these small stone cylinders across wet clay produced miniature masterpieces that carried divine imagery into everyday administrative and personal use, making the Anunnaki present even in the smallest transactions of daily life. The integration of Anunnaki theology with practical governance becomes apparent through analysis of law codes and administrative documents. The Code of Anamu, the earliest known legal compilation, begins with the declaration that the king received his authority from An and Enlil, establishing the principle that earthly justice derives from divine mandate. This legal framework positioned the Anunnaki as ultimate guarantors of social order and moral behavior. In the courts and marketplaces, these laws were not abstract ideals, but living expressions of divine will, ensuring that even the humblest citizen lived within the shadow of cosmic justice. Through these layers of language, architecture, ritual, economy, and law, the Anunnaki revealed themselves not as remote abstractions, but as the foundational forces that made civilized life possible. Their worship demanded resources, organization, and devotion on a grand scale. Yet, it returned order, legitimacy, and meaning to a world constantly threatened by flood, drought, and chaos. In the rhythmic beating of drums during Akitu, or the quiet scratching of styluses recording temple accounts, the Anunnaki continued their eternal work of holding heaven and earth in balance. Their story is one of power woven into the very fabric of society, where every ziggurat step, every legal judgment, and every festival chant echoed the same profound truth. The great gods had decreed the fates, and humanity's task was to live in accordance with that decree. The administrative complexity of Anunnaki governance crystallized around three supreme deities whose complementary domains established the fundamental structure of cosmic authority. Anu, Enlil, and Enki formed what Babylonian theologians termed the triad of great gods, each controlling essential aspects of universal order while maintaining collective responsibility for major decisions affecting both divine and mortal realms. This triumvirate system emerged from earlier Sumerian traditions, but achieved its most sophisticated expression during the Old Babylonian period, when scribes at Babylon Sipar and Nippur codified the relationships between these supreme powers in the shadowed chambers of those ancient Scripture one can almost sense the weight of their deliberations, the careful balancing of sky, storm, and water, that kept the universe from unraveling Anu's position, as Skyfather placed him at the apex of divine hierarchy, though his authority operated through delegation rather than direct intervention. Ununiform texts consistently describe him as dwelling in the highest heaven, removed from daily administration, but serving as final arbiter in disputes between lesser deities. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish portrays Anu as possessing the Anu power, a cosmic force that could be transferred to other gods during moments of crisis. When Tiamat threatened the established order, Anu attempted to confront the primordial chaos goddess, but found his authority insufficient, ultimately passing his power to Marduk for the decisive battle. This narrative demonstrates how new supremacy operated through institutional frameworks rather than personal combat prowess. Temple records from Uruk reveal the practical manifestations of Anu's authority through elaborate ritual cycles that reinforced his cosmic kingship. The Anu temple complex, rebuilt multiple times throughout Mesopotamian history, featured a distinctive architectural program that emphasized vertical ascension toward the divine realm. Priests ascending the Ziggurats, multiple levels symbolically traversed the cosmic hierarchy, with each platform representing a different sphere of divine authority. The temple's sacred marriage chamber, at its summit, provided the setting for annual rituals that renewed Anu's cosmic sovereignty through union with Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Imagine the hush that fell over Uruk on those sacred nights. the king and priestess enacting a divine drama that bound heaven to earth once more. Enlil's dominion over atmospheric phenomena and terrestrial authority positioned him as the most actively involved member of the divine triad in earthly affairs. Babylonian sources consistently identify him as Lord of the Hurricane and King of the Lands, titles that reflected his control over both natural forces and political structures. The Nippur Temple archives preserve detailed accounts of how Enlil's priests interpreted meteorological events as expressions of divine will, with storms, floods, and droughts serving as communication from the god to his human subjects. These interpretations carried significant political weight as rulers throughout Mesopotamia sought Enlil's approval for military campaigns, legal reforms, and major construction projects. One can almost hear the thunder echoing across the plains as priests scanned the skies, reading Enlil's mood in the gathering clouds, knowing that a single unfavorable omen could topple empires. The Code of Hammurabi provides concrete evidence of Enlil's role in legitimizing royal authority. The Law Code's prologue declares that Anu and Enlil appointed Hammurabi to cause justice to prevail in the land, establishing the legal principle that earthly rulers derive their authority from divine mandate. This concept of divinely sanctioned kingship required constant renewal through ritual observances at Enlil's Nippur sanctuary, where kings from across Mesopotamia travel to receive formal recognition of their legitimacy. The Tamil Chronicle records multiple instances of rulers who lost divine favor after neglecting their obligations to Enlil's temple, resulting in military defeats and political instability. Enlil's authority extended beyond political legitimation to encompass the fundamental forces that sustained agricultural civilization. Sumerian hymns describe him as Lord of Abundance, who controlled the flooding of rivers, the fertility of soil, and the productivity of livestock. The Farmer's Almanac, a practical agricultural manual preserved in multiple copies, begins with prayers to Enlil. These texts demonstrate how theological concepts translated into practical guidance for the agricultural activities that supported Mesopotamian urban centers in the fertile but unpredictable fields between the Tigris and Euphrates. Every successful harvest was a testament to Enlil's favor. Every drought a warning that the great god's anger had been kindled. Enki's sphere of influence encompassed both the freshwater sources essential for irrigation agriculture and the intellectual capacities that enabled human civilization. Babylonian mythology consistently portrays him as humanity's patron and protector, the deity who provided the knowledge and skills necessary for urban life. The Atrahasis epic describes how Enki secretly warned the flood hero of impending destruction, defying the other gods' decision to eliminate humanity through catastrophic deluge. This narrative establishes Enki as a mediating figure between divine authority and human welfare, a role that distinguished him from his more distant colleagues in the Supreme Triad. The Eridu temple complex dedicated to Enki worship served as Mesopotamia's most important center for scholarly and technical education. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive scribble schools, workshops for craftsmen, and laboratories where priests conducted early forms of chemical and medical experimentation. The temple's library contained comprehensive collections of technical manuals covering irrigation engineering, metallurgy, textile production, and pharmaceutical preparation. These practical applications of divine wisdom demonstrated how Enki's theological role translated into concrete benefits for human society. Enki's association with the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, connected him to the hydrometeorological systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible. Sumerian hymns describe him as Lord of the Flowing Water, who directed the underground streams that fed rivers, canals, and wells. The Enki and Ninhursag myth provides detailed accounts of how the god established irrigation networks and taught humans the techniques necessary for managing water resources. These narratives served both theological and practical purposes, preserving technical knowledge within religious frameworks that ensured its transmission across generations. In the minds of the ancient farmers and engineers, every canal dug and every field irrigated carried the blessing of Enki, turning the unpredictable rivers into lifelines of civilization. Together, Anu, Enlil, and Enki formed not merely a pantheon, but a living system of cosmic checks and balances, their complementary powers weaving the fabric of existence itself. Their triad was the heartbeat of Mesopotamian theology, the reason cities rose from the marshlands and laws endured through centuries of upheaval. In every storm that fertilized the soil, every canal that brought water to the fields, and every starlit ritual on a Ziggurat summit, the people felt the triad's presence, distant yet intimate, terrifying yet protective. The great gods had divided the universe among set themselves, and humanity's place within it was forever defined by their sacred collaboration. The assembly of great gods functioned as a divine legislature that deliberated on matters affecting cosmic order and human civilization. Babylonian sources described this assembly as comprising 50 Anunnaki who gathered in the Obsukina, a cosmic chamber located in Enlil's Nepor sanctuary. The assembly's proceedings followed formal protocols that paralleled earthly legal institutions, with designated speakers presenting cases, witnesses providing testimony, and judges rendering verdicts based on established precedents. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves detailed descriptions of these divine deliberations, particularly the assembly's decision to punish Gilgamesh and Enkidu for killing the Bull of Heaven and Humbaba. One can almost hear the solemn voices rising in the cosmic hall, the careful weighing of justice against mercy as the fate of heroes and cities hung in the balance. Administrative roles set within the divine assembly reflected specialized areas of cosmic responsibility. Ninhas, the mother goddess, oversaw matters related to childbirth, fertility, and the continuation of species. Her authority extended to both divine and mortal reproduction, with texts describing how she shaped the first humans from clay and established the biological processes that governed population growth. The Enki and Ninhursag composition details her role in creating various life forms and establishing the natural cycles that sustained ecological balance. In the fertile imagination of the Sumerians, every birth was a quiet echo of Ninhursag's creative touch, every field of ripening grain a testament to her nurturing power. Nana, the moon god, controlled temporal measurement and the calendar systems that structured both religious and secular activities. Babylonian astronomical texts describe his movement through the heavens as providing the fundamental rhythm for agricultural, commercial, and ritual cycles. His template housed sophisticated astronomical observation facilities where priests tracked lunar phases and calculated the complex intercalations necessary to maintain calendar accuracy. These calculations required advanced mathematical skills and represented one of Mesopotamian civilization's most significant intellectual achievements. Under the silver light of the moon, generations of priests gazed upward, their observations binding the passage of days to the will of the gods. Utu, the sun god, administered justice and served as divine witness to oaths and contracts. His daily journey across the sky positioned him as the ideal observer of human behavior, able to see all actions performed under his light. Legal documents frequently invoke Utu as guarantor of contractual obligations, with oathbreakers facing divine punishment in the form of disease, poverty, or social disgrace. The Code of Hammurabi depicts Utu presenting the law symbols to the king, establishing the principle that earthly justice reflected cosmic moral order. In the harsh glare of midday or the long shadows of evening, every merchant's bargain and every judge's verdict unfolded beneath Utu's unblinking gaze. Genealogical relationships within the Anunnaki pantheon created complex networks of authority and obligation that influenced divine decision-making. Marduk's status as Enki's son positioned him as heir to his father's wisdom while establishing his claim to supreme authority in Babylonian theology. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's gradual accumulation of power through successful completion of increasingly difficult challenges, culminating in his victory over Tiamat and appointment as king of the gods. This narrative served both theological and political purposes, legitimizing Babylon's rise to regional dominance while explaining the transfer of supreme authority from older Sumerian deities to their Babylonian successors. Family ties among the gods were never simple. They carried the same tensions, ambitions, and loyalties that shaped human dynasties. The relationship between Enlil and his sons, Nana and Ninurta, created another significant power block within the divine hierarchy. Nana's control over temporal cycles complemented his father's authority over terrestrial affairs, while Ninurta's role as divine warrior provided military support for Enlil's political decisions. The Ninurta myths describe extensive campaigns against various monsters and rebels, with the gods' victories serving to maintain cosmic order against chaotic forces. These narratives emphasize the importance of divine military power in preserving the established hierarchy against internal and external threats. In the epic tales recited in temple courtyards, Ninurta's battles became symbols of courage and order, inspiring kings and warriors alike. Marriage relationships among the Anunnaki created additional bonds that influenced divine politics. Nanna's union with Ningal produced Utu and Inanna, creating a lunar-solar dynasty that controlled both temporal measurement and justice administration. Anna's marriage to Damuzi, though ending tragically with his death and descent to the underworld, established important connections between the celestial gods and the powers governing the realm of the dead. These mythological relationships provided theological explanations for natural phenomena while creating narrative frameworks that preserved important cultural values. Love, loss, and renewal will through these divine unions, mirroring the cycles of seasons and the hopes of mortal hearts. The concept of divine assembly decision-making processes appears most clearly in epic literature, where major plot developments result from formal deliberations among the gods. The Atrahasis epic describes the assembly's decision to reduce human population through plague, famine, and finally flood. With each measure requiring formal debate and majority approval, Enki's opposition to these measures creates dramatic tension while illustrating how individual gods could challenge collective decisions through procedural means rather than direct confrontation. The Gilgamesh epic provides another detailed example of divine assembly procedures in its account of the gods' response to Gilgamesh's killing of Hanba and the Bull of Heaven. The assembly must determine appropriate punishment for these acts of defiance against divine authority, with various gods presenting arguments for different penalties. The final decision to condemn Enkidu to death represents a compromise that satisfies demands for justice while avoiding direct confrontation with Gilgamesh's divine protectors. These assembly procedures reflected sophisticated understanding of collective decision-making that parallel developments in human political institutions. The requirement for formal debate, presentation of evidence, and majority approval created checks against arbitrary divine action while ensuring that major decisions reflected broad consensus among the cosmic powers. This procedural complexity distinguished Mesopotamian theology from simpler systems, where supreme deities exercised unconstrained authority over both divine and mortal realms. In the Great Hall of the Obsukina, the Anunnaki did not rule by whim, but by reasoned counsel. Their debates a model for the councils of kings and the assemblies of citizens through the intricate web of roles, genealogies, and deliberative processes. The Anunnaki assembly revealed itself as a living government of the cosmos. Every specialized duty, every familial alliance, and every formal debate contributed to the grand equilibrium that allowed civilization to flourish. The gods were not distant tyrants, but a divine republic whose decisions shaped the rising and falling of rivers, the turning of seasons, and the destinies of nations. Their collective wisdom, forged in solemn council, became the invisible foundation upon which humanity built its first great cities, and enduring dreams of order. The theological framework established by the Anunnaki pantheon found its most profound expression in creation narratives that positioned humanity as divinely crafted laborers designed to serve the gods' earthly needs. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in multiple versions spanning from Old Babylonian to Neo-Assyrian periods, presents the most comprehensive account of humanity's origins within Anunnaki cosmology. This composition, whose title derives from its flood hero's name, meaning exceedingly wise, describes how the gods created humans to resolve a divine labor crisis that threatened the stability of cosmic order. The epic's opening passages established the fundamental problem that necessitated human creation. The Agi gods responsible for maintaining the gods' earthly estates had grown weary of their endless toil. For 40 years, these lesser deities excavated canals, built temples, and performed the agricultural work necessary to sustain divine civilization. Their rebellion began with work stoppages and protests, escalating to open defiance when they burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's residence in Nepua. The text describes how the Ig carried fire. They filled their tools with fire. Fire to the hoe flamed, the Matuk burned, creating a crisis that demanded immediate resolution from the supreme Anunnaki. Enlil's initial response involved summoning the divine assembly to address this unprecedented challenge to cosmic authority. The god's alarm at finding armed rebels at his doorstep reflects the serious nature of the threat posed by divine labor unrest. The assembly deliberations conducted in the Obshukina chamber required careful consideration of how to maintain essential work while addressing legitimate grievances from the AAGI. The solution proposed by Enki demonstrated his characteristic wisdom and concern for practical problem-solving. Create a new category of beings specifically designed for labor, thereby freeing the IAG from their set burdensome duties while ensuring continued productivity. The actual process of human creation involves sophisticated theological concepts that reveal Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between divine and mortal existence. Enki's plan required the sacrifice of Wheeler, described as a god who has intelligence, whose blood would provide the essential divine component for human nature. This sacrifice took place during the new moon, when cosmic forces aligned favorably for creation activities. The text specifies that Ninchu, the birth goddess, mixed the slain god's blood with clay to form the basic human substance, with the divine blood providing intelligence and the clay contributing physical form. The creation process involved 14 birth goddesses, each responsible for producing one male and one female human. This multiplication through divine midwifery ensured genetic diversity while establishing the reproductive capacity necessary for human population growth. The text describes how these goddesses pinched off 14 pieces of clay and shaped them into human forms through a process that took 10 months, paralleling normal gestation periods. The resulting humans possessed sufficient intelligence to understand divine commands while lacking the power to challenge their creator's authority. Enki's intervention in human creation carried profound theological implications that distinguished him from other Anunnaki and established his role as humanity's divine patron. His decision to provide humans with divine intelligence, despite knowing this gift would eventually lead to problems, demonstrated a complex understanding of the relationship between wisdom and suffering. The gods' secret addition of extra divine essence to human nature, beyond what the assembly had authorized, represented an act of divine rebellion that would have far-reaching consequences for both gods and mortals. This theological tension between collective divine authority and individual divine conscience appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as a recurring theme. Enki's willingness to defy assembly decisions when they conflicted with his personal ethics established precedents for divine dissension that would later manifest in his protection of humanity during the flood. The gods' actions raised fundamental questions about the nature of divine authority and the extent to which individual gods could pursue independent policies that contradicted collective decisions. The Atrahasis epic's treatment of human creation also addressed practical concerns about the relationship between divine and human labor. The text specifies that humans would bear the load of the gods, taking over the agricultural and construction work that had previously burdened the Agi. This arrangement created a three-tiered cosmic hierarchy, with the greater Anunnaki at the top, the AIGI serving as middle management, and humans performing manual labor at the bottom. The system's efficiency depended on maintaining clear boundaries between these categories while ensuring adequate compensation for each level's contributions. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides additional perspectives on human creation that complement and sometimes contradict the Atrahasis account. In this composition, the goddess Aruru creates Enkidu from clay in response to prayers, requesting a companion for Gilgamesh. The creation process involves the goddess washing her hands, pinching off clay, and casting it onto the step, where it takes the form of a wild man covered with hair. This more spontaneous creation method contrasts with the elaborate assembly procedures described in Atrahasis, suggesting different theological traditions about the mechanisms of divine creativity. Enkidu's initial state as a wild man who lives among animals and drinks from streams represents humanity's original condition before civilization. His transformation through contact with a temple prostitute who teaches him human customs illustrates the process by which divine wisdom civilizes natural human instincts. The 7 days and nights of sexual instruction that humanize Enkidu parallel creation narratives, in which divine knowledge transforms raw human material into civilized beings capable of urban life. The Enuma Elish presents yet another perspective on human origins that emphasizes Marduk's role as creator god following his victory over Tiamat. In this version, Marduk proposes creating humans to serve the gods after establishing cosmic order through his defeat of primordial chaos. The epic describes how Aya suggested using king's blood, since this rebel god bore primary responsibility for organizing resistance against the younger generation of deities. The creation process involves mixing Kingu's blood with clay to produce humans who will bear the service of the gods that they might be at ease. This version's emphasis on using a rebel god's blood for human creation carries different theological implications than the Atrahasis account set. Rather than sacrificing a god with intelligence, the Enuma Elish uses the blood of a defeated enemy, suggesting that human nature contains elements of both divine wisdom and rebellious tendencies. This duality explains humanity's capacity for both great achievements and destructive behavior, providing theological justification for the moral complexity that characterizes human civilization. Comparative analysis of these creation accounts reveals significant variations in how different Mesopotamian traditions understood humanity's relationship to the divine realm. The Atrahasis epic emphasizes humanity's role as divinely created laborers whose primary purpose involves serving the gods' material needs. The Gilgamesh tradition focuses more on the civilizing process that transforms natural humans into urban dwellers capable of sophisticated cultural achievements. The Enuma Elish presents human creation as part of Marduk's broader program of cosmic organization following his assumption of supreme divine authority. These variations reflect different regional and temporal perspectives on fundamental theological questions about human nature and destiny. Sumerian traditions, preserved most clearly in the Atrahasis epic, emphasized humanity's subordinate status and obligation to serve divine needs. Later Babylonian compositions showed greater interest in human potential for wisdom and cultural achievement. While maintaining the basic framework of divine superiority, Assyrian versions often stressed the importance of royal authority as divine representation on earth, connecting human creation to political legitimacy. The concept of divine image appears in various forms throughout these creation narratives, though its precise meaning remains subject to theological debate throughout Mesopotamian history. The term Salmu literally means statue or representation, suggesting that humans functioned as physical manifestations of divine presence in the earthly realm. This interpretation positioned humanity as living icons that made divine authority visible and accessible to mortal perception. Similar to how temple statues served as focal points for divine worship, alternative interpretations of Salmu emphasized functional rather than physical resemblance between gods and humans. According to this understanding, humans bore divine image through their capacity for rational thought, moral decision, and creative activity rather than through physical appearance. This functional interpretation explained how humans could serve as divine representatives while remaining clearly subordinate to their creators in power and authority. The theological debate over divine image carried practical implications for how Mesopotamian societies understood human rights and responsibilities. If humans bore divine image through rational capacity, then educational and intellectual development represented religious obligations that honored the gods who provided these gifts. If divine image involved physical resemblance, then proper care for human bodies and respect for human dignity became forms of divine worship that acknowledged the gods' creative power. Legal codes throughout Mesopotamian history reflected these theological concepts through provisions that protected human life and dignity while maintaining clear distinctions between social classes. The Code of Hams graduated penalties for crimes against persons of different social status, demonstrated how divine image concepts interacted with practical social hierarchies. Free citizens received greater protection than slaves. But even slaves possess certain rights that acknowledge their participation in divine nature through human form. Temple records document elaborate rituals designed to honor the gods for their gift of human creation, while acknowledging humanity's ongoing obligations to divine authority. New Year festivals included ceremonies that symbolically reenacted human creation, with priests molding clay figures while reciting appropriate incantations. These rituals serve both educational and devotional purposes, teaching participants about their origins while reinforcing their obligations to serve divine needs through temple support and moral behavior. The economic implications of creation theology appear clearly in temple administrative documents that detail the vast resources devoted to maintaining divine service. Thousands of workers labored in temple fields, workshops, and construction projects that sustained elaborate ritual cycles honoring the creator gods. These economic arrangements translated theological concepts about human purpose into practical systems that organized large-scale productive activities around religious obligations. Medical texts preserve additional evidence of how creation theology influenced practical understanding of human nature and health. Mesopotamian physicians understood disease as resulting from divine displeasure or demonic interference with the God's creative work. Treatment protocols typically combine practical remedies with ritual procedures, designed to restore proper relationships between patients and their divine creators. This holistic approach reflected theological understanding of humans as composite beings whose physical and spiritual components required integrated care. The preservation of creation narratives across multiple millennia demonstrates their fundamental importance for Mesopotamian cultural identity and religious practice. Scribes continuously copied, edited, and reinterpreted these texts to address changing political and social conditions while maintaining core theological principles about humanity's divine origins and ongoing obligations. This textual tradition provided stability and continuity that helped Mesopotamian civilization maintain coherent cultural identity despite frequent political upheavals and foreign conquests. The theological tensions inherent in humanity's creation as divine laborers, inevitably led to conflicts that would culminate in the most catastrophic decision recorded in Mesopotamian literature: the Anunnakis' collective determination to destroy their human creations through a devastating flood. The Atrahasis epic provides the most detailed account of the circumstances that precipitated this divine judgment, describing how human population growth and cultural development created unforeseen problems that challenged the cosmic order the gods had established. Within 600 years of human creation, the Earth had become densely populated with thriving communities that generated constant noise and activity. The consistent text describes how the land bellowed like a bull and the gods grew restless at their clamor. This disturbance proved particularly troublesome for Enlil, whose authority over terrestrial affairs made him directly responsible for maintaining order among human populations. The gods' complaints focused not merely on noise levels, but on humanity's increasing independence from direct divine supervision as growing populations developed their own social institutions and cultural practices that operated with minimal reference to divine authority. Archaeological evidence from sites like Teleson and Chomi supports the epic's portrayal of rapid population growth during the 6th millennium BCE, when improved agricultural techniques and irrigation systems enabled larger settlements to sustain themselves throughout seasonal variations. These communities developed sophisticated craft specialization, long-distance trade networks, and administrative systems that reduced their dependence on temple institutions for economic coordination. The resulting cultural autonomy represented a significant departure from the original divine plan, which had envisioned humans as docile laborers under direct godly supervision. Enlil's initial attempts to control human population growth involved sending plagues and famines that would reduce numbers to manageable levels without completely eliminating the species. The Atrahasis epic describes 3 successive attempts at population control, each involving different divine agents and methodologies. The first plague, administered through Namor, the plague god, targeted specific age groups and social classes to achieve demographic rebalancing without disrupting essential agricultural production. When this selective approach proved insufficient, Enlil authorized more comprehensive famine conditions that would force human communities to compete for scarce resources. The god's strategy involved manipulating weather patterns and agricultural conditions to create widespread food shortages that would naturally reduce population levels through starvation and conflict. Adad, the storm god, withheld the seasonal rains that enabled crop growth, while other deities responsible for fertility and abundance withdrew their support from human agricultural activities. The resulting famines achieved temporary population reductions, but failed to address the fundamental problem of human cultural independence that concerned Enlil most deeply. Enki's repeated intervention to assist humanity during these crises created mounting tension within the divine assembly and established the theological framework for the flood narrative. The gods' provision of alternative food sources, irrigation techniques, and survival strategies enabled human communities to weather divine punishment more successfully than Enlil had anticipated. These interventions violated the assembly's collective decisions and represented a form of divine insubordination that challenged the hierarchical authority structure governing Anunnaki relationships. The escalating conflict between Enlil and Enki reflected deeper theological questions about the nature of divine justice and the extent to which individual gods could pursue independent policies that contradicted collective decisions. Enlil's position emphasized the importance of maintaining cosmic order through strict enforcement of divine authority, while Enki's actions suggested that wisdom and compassion should temper the application of divine power. This fundamental disagreement about divine governance would reach its climax in the flood decision and its aftermath. The Assembly's final decision to destroy humanity through flood represented a compromise that addressed Enlil's concerns about human independence while providing a definitive solution to the population problem. The Atrahasis epic describes elaborate deliberations in which various gods presented arguments for different approaches to the human crisis. Some deities supported Enlil's position that complete destruction was necessary to restore proper cosmic order, while others advocated for more moderate measures that would preserve human civilization while addressing legitimate divine concerns. The flood mechanism itself reflected sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and meteorological processes that characterized Mesopotamian civilization's relationship with its riverine environment. The gods' decision to overwhelm existing flood control systems through coordinated attacks on multiple fronts demonstrated their comprehensive knowledge of the infrastructure that sustained human settlements. Adad would provide unprecedented rainfall from above, while Enki would release subterranean waters from the Abzu, creating a dual assault that would overwhelm even the most sophisticated human engineering projects. The Assembly's oath of secrecy regarding the flood plan created the dramatic tension that drives the narrative forward and establishes Enki's moral dilemma. The gods swore binding oaths that prevented them from directly warning humans about the impending destruction. But these restrictions applied only to direct communication rather than indirect methods that preserve the letter while violating the spirit of the agreement. Enki's solution involved speaking to the reed wall of Atra's house rather than to the man himself, a technical compliance with the oath that enabled him to provide essential survival information. The instructions Enki provided to Atrahasis through this indirect communication method revealed detailed knowledge of shipbuilding techniques and survival strategies that reflect actual Mesopotamian maritime technology. The gods specified exact dimensions for the vessel that would preserve human and animal life through the flood, 120 cubits in length, width, and height, creating a perfect cube that symbolized cosmic completeness. The ship's construction required specific materials, including palm fiber, bitumen, and various types of wood that were readily available in southern Mesopotamia and possessed the waterproofing qualities necessary for extended ocean voyaging. The 7-day construction period that Enki allowed for the ark's completion paralleled the cosmic week that structured divine and human temporal experience throughout Mesopotamian culture. This timeline required Atrahasis to mobilize extensive community resources and labor while maintaining secrecy about the project's true purpose. The text describes how the builder provided food and drink for his workers while deflecting questions about the vessel's intended use, claiming it was designed for a trading expedition to distant lands. The loading of animals onto the ark followed systematic procedures that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of species preservation and ecological relationships. Atrahasis gathered breeding pairs of wild animals, while also including domestic species that would be essential for re-establishing agricultural civilization after the floodwaters receded. The text specifies that clean animals were taken in groups of 7 pairs, while unclean species were limited to single pairs, establishing distinctions that would later appear in Hebrew flood narratives, but reflected earlier Mesopotamian concepts about ritual purity and sacrifice. The flood itself began with supernatural phenomena that announced the cosmic significance of the impending destruction. The Atrahasis epic describes how normal weather patterns ceased as divine forces took direct control of atmospheric and hydrometeorological systems. Darkness covered the earth even during daylight hours, while earthquake tremors announced the release of subterranean waters that would supplement the torrential rains. These preliminary signs provided final warnings for any humans who possess sufficient wisdom to interpret divine communications through natural phenomena. The actual deluge combined multiple water sources in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed all existing flood control infrastructure. Adad storms provided continuous rainfall that exceeded the capacity of drainage systems, while the Anunnaki collectively opened the fountains of the great deep that released underground. Water reserves. The Epic of Gilgamesh's parallel account describes how even the gods were frightened by the flood's intensity, with Ishtar crying out in distress at the destruction of her human worshippers and the Anunnaki cowering like dogs in the highest heavens. The 7-day duration of the flood proper corresponded to the cosmic week, while providing sufficient time for complete inundation of inhabited areas. The waters rose above the highest mountains, eliminating all terrestrial life except for the carefully preserved specimens aboard Atrahasis' vessel. The text describes how human settlements, temples, and agricultural infrastructure disappeared beneath the expanding waters, erasing millennia of cultural development and technological achievement in a matter of days. The psychological impact of the flood on the divine assembly became apparent as the destruction proceeded beyond what many gods had anticipated or desired. The Gilgamesh version describes Ishtar's regret at supporting the flood decision, while other deities expressed dismay at the complete elimination of the worship and offerings that had sustained divine-human relationships. These emotional responses reveal the extent to which the gods had become dependent on human service and highlighted the economic dimensions of the crisis that the flood created for divine society. Enki's secret preservation of human civilization through his warning to Atrahasis represented more than simple compassion. It constituted a calculated strategy to maintain the benefits of human service while addressing legitimate concerns about population control and cultural independence. The gods' actions ensured that post-flood humanity would possess the knowledge and skills necessary to rebuild civilization while remaining appropriately grateful for divine intervention in their survival. This approach balanced competing interests within the divine assembly while preserving the fundamental relationship between gods and mortals. The flood's conclusion involved carefully orchestrated procedures that tested the extent of destruction while preparing for the restoration of normal cosmic order. Atrahasis released birds at regular intervals to determine when dry land had emerged sufficiently to support renewed habitation. The dove's return with an olive leaf provided confirmation that vegetation had begun to recover, while the raven's failure to return indicated that carrion from the flood victims had been sufficiently dispersed to prevent disease outbreaks. The arks, landing on Mount Nar, identified with modern Pir Omar Gudrun in the Zagros Mountains, positioned the flood survivors in highland territory that had remained above the floodwaters and possessed the resources necessary for immediate survival. This location provided access to fresh water, wild game, and materials for constructing temporary shelters. While the lowland areas dried sufficiently for permanent resettlement, the mountains' sacred associations in later Mesopotamian tradition reflected its role as the birthplace of renewed human civilization. Atrahasis' first act upon leaving the ark involved constructing an altar and offering sacrifices that announced humanity's survival to the divine assembly. The smoke from these offerings, described as having a sweet savor, attracted the gods who had been deprived of human worship throughout the flood period. The Gilgamesh account describes how the gods gathered like flies around the sacrifice, emphasizing their eagerness to re-establish the economic relationships that human worship provided. The assembly's response to discovering human survival created the final crisis that required resolution through a new covenant between gods and mortals. Enlil's initial rage at learning that his flood plan had been subverted by Enki's intervention threatened to restart the divine conflict that had precipitated the original crisis. The gods' demand for punishment of those responsible for preserving humanity forced the assembly to address fundamental questions about divine authority and the limits of collective decision-making power. Enki's defense of his actions before the divine assembly established precedents for divine descent that would influence Mesopotamian theology throughout subsequent periods. The god argued that complete human destruction would have eliminated the worship and service that sustained divine civilization, creating problems for the gods themselves that outweighed any benefits from population control. His speech emphasized practical considerations about divine-human economic relationships, while acknowledging the legitimacy of concerns about human independence and cultural development. The Assembly's final resolution involved establishing new parameters for divine-human relationships that addressed the concerns that had led to the flood while preventing future conflicts of similar magnitude. The gods agreed to impose natural limits on human population growth, through increased infant mortality, diseases that would affect specific age groups, and social institutions like celibate priesthood that would reduce reproductive rates. These measures would maintain manageable population levels without requiring periodic, catastrophic interventions that disrupted the stability of both divine and human societies. The Covenant's provisions regarding divine accessibility represented another significant innovation. That addressed human cultural independence while maintaining appropriate hierarchical relationships. The gods agreed to communicate their will through established channels including divination, dreams, and prophetic inspiration, rather than through direct intervention that had characterized earlier periods. This arrangement preserved divine authority while allowing human societies to develop their own institutions and cultural practices within parameters acceptable to their divine overseers. The covenant established between the Anunnaki and Set, humanity following the Great Flood, created the theological foundation for a revolutionary system of urban governance that would define Mesopotamian civilization for over 3 millennia. Rather than maintaining direct oversight of human affairs through periodic divine interventions, the gods established permanent earthly residences within specific city-states, creating a patron deity system that distributed divine authority across the geographical landscape while maintaining hierarchical relationships within the celestial bureaucracy. This decentralized approach to divine governance allowed individual Anunnaki to develop intimate relationships with particular human communities while preserving the collective authority of the divine assembly for matters affecting the broader cosmic order. Enlil's selection of Nippur as his primary earthly residence established the paradigm for divine city patronage that other Anunnaki would follow throughout Sumer and Akkad. The god's choice reflected both practical and theological considerations that would influence urban development patterns across Mesopotamia. Nippur's central location within the alluvial plain provided equal access to all major Sumerian cities, making it an ideal site for a deity whose authority encompassed the entire region. The city's elevation above the surrounding marshlands offered protection from seasonal flooding while maintaining access to the waterways that connected it to other urban centers through an extensive network of canals and rivers. The Aqua temple complex that housed Enlil's earthly residence represented the most sophisticated architectural achievement of early dynastic Mesopotamia, establishing design principles that would influence religious construction throughout the ancient Near East. The temple's massive ziggurat, rising in 7 distinct stages toward the heavens, created a physical representation of the cosmic hierarchy that placed Enlil at the intersection between divine and human realms. Each level of the structure serves specific ritual functions with priests ascending through increasingly sacred spaces as they approach the god's private chambers at the summit. Archaeological excavations at Nippur have revealed the extensive infrastructure required to support Enlil's earthly establishment, including residential quarters for hundreds of priests, workshops for producing ritual objects, granaries for storing agricultural offerings, and administrative offices where scribes maintain detailed records of temple operations. The complex employed thousands of workers whose specialized skills sustained elaborate ritual, cycles that reinforced Enlil's authority over both natural phenomena and human political structures. Craftsmen produced the ceremonial weapons, jewelry, and textiles that adorned the god's cult statue, while musicians and singers performed the hymns and liturgies that accompanied daily worship services. The economic scale of Enlil's temple operations dwarfed those of any secular institution in Mesopotamian society, with administrative archives documenting the management of vast agricultural estates, livestock herds, and manufacturing enterprises that generated the wealth necessary to sustain divine service. The Draham archive, dating to the Earth III period, records the delivery of over 100,000 cattle and sheep annually to Enlil's temple for sacrificial purposes, indicating the massive scale of resources devoted to maintaining divine favor. These offerings came from throughout Mesopotamia as rulers from distant cities sent tribute to acknowledge Enlil's supreme authority and seek his blessing for their political and military endeavors. Enki's establishment at Eridu created a contrasting model of divine city patronage that emphasized wisdom, craftsmanship, and the technical knowledge essential for urban civilization. The god's temple complex included extensive educational facilities where scribes learned the cuneiform writing system. Mathematicians developed computational techniques for architectural and astronomical calculations, and engineers studied the hydraulic principles that enabled irrigation agriculture. These scholarly activities positioned Eridu as Mesopotamia's premier center for intellectual development, attracting students from across the region who sought training in the specialized skills that sustained urban society. The Abzu temple's unique architectural features reflected Enki's association with freshwater sources. His role as patron of the crafts that transformed raw materials into useful products. The temple's foundation extended below ground level to create a symbolic connection with the underground waters that fed Mesopotamia's rivers and canals, while its workshops produced the finest examples of metal work, textile production, and ceramic manufacture found anywhere in the ancient world. Master craftsmen, working under divine patronage, developed innovative techniques that advanced technological capabilities while creating objects of extraordinary beauty and utility. Enki's priests maintained detailed records of technical procedures and scientific observations that constituted Mesopotamia's earliest systematic approach to empirical knowledge. Medical texts preserved in the temple library documented surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques that represented sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and disease processes. Mathematical tablets recorded computational methods for calculating areas, volumes, and astronomical cycles that enabled accurate calendaring and architectural planning. These scholarly achievements demonstrated how divine patronage could foster intellectual development that benefited both religious and secular aspects of human civilization. Inanna's patronage of Uruk established yet another model of divine city governance that emphasized the dynamic relationship between sacred and secular authority through the institution of sacred marriage. The goddess's dual nature, as deity of both love and war, created theological tensions that required careful management through elaborate ritual cycles that channeled her potentially destructive energies toward constructive purposes. Her temple complex, known as the Ayana, featured separate precincts dedicated to her contrasting aspects with priests, specializing in either martial or fertility functions, depending on seasonal requirements and political circumstances. The sacred marriage ceremony that annually renewed Inanna's relationship with the reigning king of Europe represented the most sophisticated expression of divine human political integration achieved in Mesopotamian civilization. This ritual, known as Heroes Gamos, involved the king assuming the role of Dumuzi, Inanna's mythological consort, in a ceremonial union that symbolically transferred divine authority to earthly rulership while ensuring the goddess's continued support for the city's prosperity and military success. The ceremony required months of preparation involving purification rituals, costume preparation, and rehearsals that transformed the king from a mortal ruler into a temporary embodiment of divine power. The architectural setting for the sacred marriage reflected the ceremony's cosmic significance through careful attention to astronomical alignments and symbolic decoration that connected earthly events to celestial patterns. The temple's marriage chamber, located at the Ziggurats summit, featured elaborate furnishings, including a golden bed, precious textiles, and ritual objects that had been consecrated through preliminary ceremonies involving the entire population of Uruk. The chamber's windows are lined with specific stellar configurations that marked the optimal timing for the ritual's performance, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles and their relationship to agricultural and political activities. The economic implications of the sacred marriage extended far beyond its religious significance to encompass comprehensive systems of resource, distribution, and social organization that integrated divine worship with practical governance. The ceremony's successful completion ensured Inanna's blessing for the coming agricultural year, with the goddess's favor manifesting through abundant harvests, successful military campaigns, and prosperous trade relationships with neighboring cities. Conversely, any disruption of the ritual cycle could result in divine displeasure expressed through crop failures, military defeats, or economic instability that threatened the city's survival. Nanna's patronage created the most economically sophisticated temple administration in Mesopotamian history, with the moon god's priests developing innovative financial instruments and commercial practices that facilitated long-distance trade throughout the ancient world. The god's association with temporal measurement positioned his temple as the authoritative source for calendar calculations that coordinated agricultural, commercial, and religious activities across multiple city-states. Merchants throughout Mesopotamia synchronized their trading expeditions with lunar cycles calculated by Nanna's priests, while farmers planning and harvesting schedules according to calendars distributed from the temple complex. The ziggurat of Nana Atr, known as the Echkishnu, featured sophisticated astronomical observation facilities that enabled precise tracking of lunar phases and planetary movements essential for maintaining calendar accuracy. The temple's archives preserve thousands of mathematical tablets documenting the complex calculations required to reconcile lunar months with solar years, a computational challenge that required advanced understanding of fractional arithmetic and algebraic relationships. These mathematical achievements represented some of the most sophisticated intellectual work produced in the ancient world, demonstrating how religious requirements could drive technological innovation that benefited broader society. The priesthood hierarchies that developed within each city's patron temple reflected the specialized knowledge and administrative skills required to maintain divine service while managing vast economic enterprises. At Nippur, Enlil's high priest, known as the En, served as the god's primary, earthly representative with authority over religious, political, and economic affairs that affected the entire Sumerian confederation. This position required mastery of theological doctrine, legal precedents, and administrative procedures that enabled effective coordination between divine will and human needs across multiple domains of activity. Subordinate priestly ranks included the Sangu, who supervised daily temple operations and managed the extensive workforce required for ritual performance and economic production. These middle-level administrators possess specialized knowledge of liturgical requirements, accounting procedures, and craft techniques that enable them to coordinate complex activities involving hundreds of workers and massive resource flows. The Mashipu priest specialized in ritual purification and exorcism, maintaining the spiritual cleanliness essential for effective divine communication, while the Kol priest performed the musical liturgies that accompanied sacrificial offerings and seasonal celebrations. The training required for priestly service involved decades of study in temple schools, where students mastered ununiform literacy, mathematical computation, astronomical observation, and theological doctrine necessary for effective temple administration. The curriculum included extensive memorization of hymns, prayers, and ritual procedures that preserve traditional practices while allowing for adaptation to changing circumstances. Advanced students specialized in particular aspects of temple operations, developing expertise in areas such as divination, medical practice, or commercial law that enabled them to serve both religious and secular functions within their communities. Women played crucial roles within temple hierarchies, particularly in institutions dedicated to goddesses like Inanna, where female priests known as Inu served as the deity's primary earthly representatives. These high-ranking priestesses possessed authority comparable to their male counterparts, supervising extensive temple operations while maintaining the ritual purity essential for divine communication. The Enu of Inanna at Uruk held responsibility for the sacred marriage ceremony, serving as the goddess's earthly embodiment during the king's symbolic union with divine power. The Naditu priestesses, documented extensively in old Babylonian archives, represented another category of female religious specialists who combined spiritual service with commercial activities that generated substantial income for temple institutions. These women, who remained celibate throughout their careers, managed agricultural estates, engaged in money-lending operations, and coordinated trade relationships that connected temple economies with broader commercial networks. Their business activities required sophisticated understanding of contract law, market conditions, and financial instruments that positioned them among the most economically knowledgeable individuals in Mesopotamian society. Temple architecture evolved to accommodate the complex ritual requirements and administrative functions that characterized mature Anunnaki worship, with successive building phases creating increasingly elaborate complexes that dominated their urban environments. The standard temple layout included a central sanctuary housing the deity's cult statue, surrounded by chambers for storing ritual implements, preparing offerings, and housing priests. Courtyards provided space for large-scale ceremonies involving entire urban populations, while administrative wings contained archives, workshops, and residential quarters necessary for temple operations. The technological sophistication of temple construction reflected both religious requirements and practical considerations about structural stability and environmental adaptation. Builders developed innovative techniques for creating waterproof foundations in marshy terrain, constructing earthquake-resistant walls capable of supporting massive superstructures, and designing drainage systems that prevented flood damage to sacred precincts. The use of fired brick rather than sun-dried mud brick for temple construction demonstrated the enormous resources devoted to creating permanent divine residences that would endure across multiple generations. Ritual practices within Anunnaki. Temples followed carefully prescribed procedures that maintained divine favor while providing meaningful religious experiences for human participants. Daily services included morning and evening offerings of food, drink, and incense that sustained the deities. Earthly residence, accompanied by musical performances and liturgical recitations that honored divine attributes and requested continued blessing. The god's cult statue received personal care, including washing, clothing changes, and presentation of meals that treated the divine image as a living presence, requiring constant attention. Seasonal festivals created opportunities for entire urban populations to participate in divine worship through processions, communal meals, and ritual performances that reinforced social cohesion while honoring patron deities. The Akitu New Year celebration involved elaborate ceremonies that symbolically renewed divine kingship and cosmic order, with the patron deity statue traveling throughout the city to receive homage from all social classes. These public rituals demonstrated divine approval for existing political arrangements, while providing opportunities for rulers to display their piety and generosity through magnificent offerings and entertainment. For their subjects, the integration of divine worship with practical governance created temple institutions that functioned as comprehensive administrative centers, managing legal disputes, commercial transactions, and social services that affected entire urban populations. Temple courts adjudicated conflicts involving contract violations, property disputes, and family law matters, with priests serving as judges whose decisions carried divine authority. These legal functions positioned temples as essential institutions for maintaining social order while ensuring that human behavior conformed to divine moral standards. The political ascendancy of Babylon during the early 2nd millennium BCE fundamentally transformed Anunnaki theology through the systematic elevation of Marduk from a relatively minor deity to supreme king of the gods. This theological revolution, codified most comprehensively in the Enumerish creation epic, represented far more than simple religious propaganda supporting Babylonian political ambitions. The restructuring of divine hierarchy required sophisticated theological arguments that preserved the authority of established Anunnaki while accommodating Marduk's unprecedented rise to cosmic supremacy. Marduk's genealogical credentials as Enki's son provided the essential foundation for his claim to supreme authority within existing Anunnaki structures. Babylonian theologians emphasized his inheritance of his father's wisdom and technical expertise, while adding martial prowess that distinguished him from the contemplative Enki. The god's youth represented an advantage rather than a liability in confronting primordial chaos forces that threatened to destabilize cosmic order. As older deities like Anu and Enlil had proven inadequate to the challenge posed by Tiamat's rebellion, the Enuma Elish's account of Marduk's rise to power through combat with Tiamat Poi. Tiamat established precedents for divine authority based on demonstrated capability rather than traditional inheritance or seniority. The epic describes how the established gods faced with Tiamat's threat to destroy the younger generation of deities offered supreme kingship to any god capable of defeating the primordial chaos monster. Marduk's acceptance of this challenge, contingent on receiving permanent authority over all divine decisions, created a contractual basis for his supremacy that satisfied legal requirements while acknowledging his exceptional qualifications. The weapons and powers that Marduk assembled for his confrontation with Tiamat reflected Babylonian understanding of the technological and organizational capabilities required for effective governance. The god's bow, described as creating lightning when drawn, represented mastery over atmospheric phenomena previously associated with Enlil's authority. His net, woven from the four winds, demonstrated control over directional forces that enabled comprehensive military strategy. The hurricane that filled his body provided the raw power necessary to overwhelm opposition, while his chariot, drawn by 4 horses, enabled rapid movement across cosmic battlefields. Marduk's tactical approach to defeating Tiamat revealed sophisticated military thinking that would influence Babylonian strategic doctrine throughout subsequent periods. Rather than engaging in direct frontal assault, the god employed deception and superior technology to neutralize his opponent's advantages. His inflation of Tiamat, through forced ingestion of wind, rendered her vulnerable to internal attack, while his net prevented her escape. Once the battle commenced, the precision shot that split her body in half demonstrated marksmanship skills that required extensive training and natural talent. The cosmic reorganization that followed Marduk's victory established new principles of divine core administration that centralized authority while maintaining functional specialization among subordinate deities. The god's division of Tiamat's corpse to create heaven and earth positioned him as supreme architect of the physical universe, while his appointment of other Anunnaki to specific administrative roles preserved their dignity within the new hierarchy. This reorganization balanced revolutionary change with conservative preservation of existing institutions, enabling a smooth transition to Babylonian theological supremacy. The 50 names of Marduk, recited at the Enuma Elish's conclusion, provided comprehensive theological justification for the god's absorption of powers and attributes previously distributed among multiple Anunnaki. The identification of Marduk with Zeus and Nu with Apollo reflected systematic attempts to create theological bridges between different cultural traditions while preserving essential Mesopotamian religious content. These syncretistic developments influenced both Greek understanding of Near Eastern religion and Mesopotamian adaptation to Hellenistic cultural contexts. The astronomical interests that characterized late Mesopotamian scholarship created new interpretive frameworks for understanding Anunnaki mythology through celestial observations and mathematical analysis. Babylonian astronomers identified individual deities with specific stars and planetary movements, creating systematic correspondences between mythological narratives and observable celestial phenomena. These scientific approaches to religious interpretation influence both indigenous theological development and the transmission of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge to Greek and later Islamic scholars. The persistence of Anunnaki worship into the Parthian and Sasanian periods demonstrated the deep cultural roots that these religious traditions had developed throughout 3 millennia of continuous practice. Archaeological evidence from sites like Babylon and Uruk shows continued temple maintenance and ritual activity well into the Common Era, with cuneiform texts documenting traditional ceremonies performed for increasingly small communities of practitioners. These late manifestations of ancient traditions preserved essential theological concepts that would influence subsequent religious developments in the region. The gradual transformation of Anunnaki concepts into folk traditions and magical practices reflected the adaptation of sophisticated theological systems to changing social and political circumstances that no longer supported elaborate temple institutions. Incantation texts from the early Islamic period show how individual Anunnaki continued to be invoked for protection and assistance in personal matters. Though their cosmic authority had been superseded by monotheistic religious systems, these survivals demonstrate the enduring appeal of Mesopotamian religious concepts and their influence on subsequent cultural developments throughout the Near East and beyond. Alexander the Great's conquest of Babylon in 331 BCE marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Anunnaki worship that would fundamentally alter the character of Mesopotamian religious practice over the subsequent centuries. The Macedonian king's initial respect for local religious traditions, demonstrated through his participation in traditional Babylonian coronation ceremonies and his orders to restore damaged temples, created a deceptive continuity that masked the deeper cultural changes his conquest would unleash. The young conqueror's death in Babylon 8 years later, possibly in the very palace where Nebuchadnezzar had once ruled, symbolically marked the end of purely Mesopotamian control over the religious traditions that had shaped the region for 3 millennia. The Seleucid dynasty's establishment of Greek administrative systems throughout their vast empire created unprecedented challenges for traditional Anunnaki worship as holistic bureaucratic structures operated according to fundamentally different principles than the temple-centered governance that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian civilization. Greek administrators trained in philosophical traditions that emphasized rational inquiry and systematic classification approached religious phenomena as subjects for intellectual analysis rather than objects of devotional practice. This analytical perspective, while not necessarily hostile to local traditions, created conceptual frameworks that gradually transformed how educated populations understood divine authority and cosmic order. The foundation of Sequa on the Tigris as a new administrative capital deliberately positioned Greek colonial authority alongside, rather than within existing Mesopotamian urban centers, creating parallel power structures that competed for resources and population. The new cities, Greek theater, gymnasium, and agora, provided alternative social institutions that attracted ambitious Mesopotamians seeking advancement within Hellenistic administrative hierarchies. These secular civic spaces offered cultural experiences that rivaled traditional temple festivals in their ability to create community, identity, and social cohesion, gradually reducing the exclusive authority that religious institutions had previously exercised over urban life. The intellectual ferment created by contact between Greek philosophical traditions and Mesopotamian theological scholarship produced remarkable synthetic developments that preserved essential Anunnaki concepts while adapting them to Hellenistic cultural contexts. Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the early 3rd century BCE, created the most comprehensive attempt to present Mesopotamian religious traditions to Greek audiences through his Babylonia, a 3-volume work that translated ununiform mythological narratives into Greek literary forms while maintaining their essential theological content. His account of the Anunnaki as divine beings who descended from heaven to teach humanity the arts of civilization resonated with Greek traditions about culture heroes and divine benefactors, creating conceptual bridges between different mythological systems. The identification of individual Anunnaki with Greek deities represented a systematic theological project that required careful analysis of divine attributes and functions to establish meaningful correspondences between different religious traditions. Marduk's identification with Zeus reflected obvious parallels in their roles as supreme kings of their respective pantheons, while both deities' associations with storm phenomena and royal authority provided additional points of connection. However, this identification also transformed understanding of Marduk's character by emphasizing his role as cosmic ruler while de-emphasizing the complex theological relationships with other Anunnaki that had characterized traditional Babylonian religious thought. Nabu's equation with Apollo created particularly productive synthetic possibilities as both deities governed intellectual activities, including writing, prophecy, and artistic inspiration. The Greek god's association with the Delphic oracle provided a familiar framework for understanding Nibu's role in divination, while his patronage of poetry and music resonated with the Mesopotamian deities' connection to scholarly and scribal activities. Hellenistic period texts from Babylon show how this identification enabled Greek-educated Mesopotamians to participate in both cultural traditions simultaneously, invoking Apollo Nabu in context that required both Greek literary sophistication and traditional Mesopotamian religious authority. The syncretistic developments that emerged in multicultural Hellenistic cities created unprecedented religious innovations that combined Anunnaki theology with Greek philosophical concepts and Egyptian magical practices. The city of Dura Europos, on the Euphrates, founded by Seleucus I around 300 BCE, provides archaeological evidence for this religious creativity through temple complexes that housed multiple traditions within shared architectural spaces. The site's Mesopotamian temple featured traditional Babylonian religious art alongside Greek-style sculptures and inscriptions, while ritual deposits included objects reflecting Egyptian, Persian, and Arabian religious influences. The transformation of Anunnaki worship in Hellenistic urban contexts involved significant changes in ritual practice that reflected new social realities and cultural preferences. Traditional temple festivals that had previously involved entire urban populations became more specialized events that attracted primarily those families. Maintaining ancestral connections to Mesopotamian religious traditions, the elaborate processions and public ceremonies that had once demonstrated divine authority to mixed populations were replaced by more intimate gatherings that emphasized community identity and cultural preservation rather than cosmic governance. The role of Babylonian astronomers in preserving Anunnaki mythological traditions became crucial during this period of cultural transition, as their scientific expertise provided them with unique authority that transcended political and religious boundaries. The astronomical diaries maintained by temple scholars documented celestial observations with unprecedented precision while preserving traditional associations between planetary movements and divine activities. These scientific records enabled Babylonian astronomers to maintain their professional status within Hellenistic intellectual circles while continuing to serve traditional religious functions within their local communities. The mathematical sophistication achieved by Babylonian astronomers during the Susid period represented the culmination of millennia of scholarly development that had been fostered by temple institutions dedicated to Anunnaki worship. The development of sophisticated predictive models for planetary motion required computational techniques that surpassed contemporary Greek mathematical capabilities, earning them recognition throughout the Hellenistic world as the foremost authorities on celestial phenomena. This scientific reputation enabled them to preserve and transmit traditional mythological interpretations of astronomical events to audiences that might otherwise have dismissed Mesopotamian religious concepts as primitive superstition. The Babylonian astronomer Kadinu, working during the 4th century BCE, exemplified this synthesis of scientific rigor with traditional religious knowledge through his development of mathematical models that could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, while maintaining traditional interpretations of these events as manifestations of divine displeasure or cosmic conflict. His computational methods, preserved in cuneiform mathematical texts, influenced both Hellenistic astronomical theory and traditional Mesopotamian divination practices, demonstrating how scientific innovation could serve both secular and religious purposes simultaneously. The gradual transformation of Anunnaki from active deities governing cosmic affairs to astrological and magical figures reflected broader cultural changes that reduced the political authority of traditional religious institutions while preserving their specialized knowledge for private consultation. Hellenistic period magical papyri from Egypt contain numerous invocations of Mesopotamian deities, but these texts treat the Anunnaki as powerful spirits available for individual magical manipulation, rather than as cosmic rulers whose authority shaped political and natural events. This transformation preserved the names and basic attributes of traditional deities while fundamentally altering their theological significance and social function. The development of personal horoscopic astrology during the Hellenistic period created new context for Anunnaki influence that emphasized individual destiny rather than collective cosmic governance. Babylonian astronomers adapted their traditional knowledge of planetary deity associations to create personalized predictions based on birth dates and celestial configurations, transforming cosmic theology into practical guidance for private decision-making. This individualization of divine influence reflected broader Hellenistic cultural trends that emphasize personal achievement and private religious experience over communal identity and public ritual observance. The magical traditions that emerged from this transformation treated individual Anunnaki as specialized, supernatural agents whose powers could be accessed through appropriate ritual procedures and incantations. Marduk's authority over cosmic order made him particularly valuable for magical practices designed to impose control over chaotic situations, while Enki's association with wisdom and technical knowledge attracted practitioners seeking solutions to complex practical problems. These magical applications preserve detailed knowledge of traditional divine attributes while adapting them to serve individual rather than communal needs. The persistence of cuneiform literacy among specialized scholarly communities enabled the continued copying and study of Anunnaki texts long after Aramaic and Greek had become the dominant languages for most administrative and commercial purposes. The latest, datable ununiform tablets from Babylon, produced during the 1st century CE, include copies of classical mythological compositions alongside astronomical and mathematical texts, indicating that traditional religious literature continued to be valued by scholarly communities even as its broader social relevance declined. The influence of Mesopotamian astronomical and astrological knowledge on Hellenistic intellectual culture created indirect channels through which Anunnaki concepts reached Mediterranean audiences that had no direct contact with Mesopotamian religious traditions. Greek astronomical texts incorporated Babylonian computational methods and observational data, while often preserving traditional deity names for planetary bodies and stellar configurations. This scientific transmission ensured that Anunnaki nomenclature and basic mythological associations would influence Western astronomical and astrological traditions for centuries after the collapse of Mesopotamian temple institutions. The Jewish communities that remained in Mesopotamia following the Babylonian exile developed complex relationships with traditional Anunnaki, worship that involved both rejection of polytheistic theology and adaptation of Mesopotamian religious concepts to monotheistic frameworks. The Book of Daniel's references to Babylonian religious practices demonstrate detailed knowledge of temple rituals and divine hierarchies, while apocalyptic literature from this period shows clear influence from Mesopotamian mythological narratives about cosmic conflict and divine judgment. These adaptations preserved essential structural elements of Anunnaki theology while transforming their theological significance to conform with Jewish monotheistic requirements. The Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia during the 2nd century BCE created new political contexts that were more favorable to traditional religious practices than Hellenistic rule had been. As Parthian administrative policies generally respected local cultural autonomy while requiring only political loyalty to imperial authority, archaeological evidence from Babylonian temple sites shows renewed construction activity and ritual innovation during the early Parthian period, suggesting that reduced Greek cultural pressure enabled partial revival of traditional religious institutions. However, these revivals operated within fundamentally altered social contexts that limited their scope and influence compared to earlier periods of Mesopotamian independence. The emergence of Mandan religious communities in southern Mesopotamia during the late Hellenistic or early Parthian period preserved significant elements of traditional Anunnaki mythology within Gnostic theological frameworks that emphasized esoteric knowledge and spiritual salvation. Mandan texts contain detailed cosmological narratives that show clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian creation myths, while their ritual practices preserve techniques and terminology that derive from traditional temple liturgies. These religious developments demonstrate how ancient theological concepts could be adapted to serve new spiritual needs while maintaining essential continuity with earlier traditions. The influence of Zoroastrian religious concepts on late Mesopotamian religious development created additional, synthetic possibilities that combined Anunnaki theology with Persian dualistic cosmology and eschatological expectations. Texts from the Sasanian period show how traditional Mesopotamian deities were incorporated into Zoroastrian cosmic hierarchies as Yazatas, or divine beings serving Ahura Mazda's cosmic authority. This theological accommodation enabled continued veneration of traditional deities within frameworks that satisfied Persian religious requirements while preserving essential elements of Mesopotamian religious identity. The transformation of Anunnaki worship during the Hellenistic era represented more than simple decline or cultural assimilation. It involved creative adaptation of ancient religious traditions to new social and intellectual contexts that preserved essential theological insights while enabling continued cultural relevance. The scientific achievements of Babylonian astronomers, the synthetic religious developments in multicultural cities, and the preservation of traditional knowledge through specialized scholarly communities all contributed to ensuring that Mesopotamian religious concepts would continue to influence subsequent cultural developments long after the collapse of the political and social institutions that had originally sustained them. The gradual dissolution of traditional Mesopotamian temple institutions during the early centuries of the Common Era didn't mark the complete disappearance of Anunnaki traditions from the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. Instead, these theological and mythological concepts underwent a complex process of preservation and transformation through networks of scholars, translators, and religious communities that maintained fragments of ancient wisdom within new cultural and linguistic contexts. The transmission of Mesopotamian knowledge during late antiquity occurred through multiple channels that often operated independently of each other, creating a diverse array of sources that preserve different aspects of Anunnaki traditions according to their specific intellectual interests and cultural requirements. The Syriac Christian communities that emerged in northern Mesopotamia during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE played a crucial role in preserving astronomical and mathematical knowledge that had originally developed within Anunnaki temple complexes. These scholars, working primarily in Edessa, Nis, and other centers of Syriac learning, translated Greek astronomical texts that incorporated Babylonian computational methods while also maintaining direct access to uniform sources through bilingual scholars who could still read the ancient script. The Syriac translation of Tomi's Almagest, completed during the 6th century, preserved Babylonian star, catalogues, and planetary theories that contain traditional deity names and mythological associations, ensuring that Anunnaki nomenclature would continue to influence astronomical terminology throughout the medieval period. The scholarly activities of figures like Cus Sebok, working in the monastery of Kessian during the 7th century, demonstrated how Syriac intellectuals maintained sophisticated understanding of Mesopotamian mathematical and astronomical paterae and astronomical traditions long after the collapse of the institutional structures that had originally sustained them. Sebok's treatise on the astrolabe included detailed discussions of Babylonian computational methods for calculating planetary positions, while his mathematical works preserved numerical techniques that derived ultimately from Kunya for mathematical texts. His famous reference to Indian numerals as superior to Greek systems reflected comparative analysis that drew on multiple mathematical traditions, including Mesopotamian methods that he accessed through both Greek and Syriac sources. The Mandan religious communities of southern Mesopotamia preserved perhaps the most direct continuity with ancient Anunnaki traditions through their maintenance of ritual practices and mythological narratives that showed clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian religious literature. The Mandan creation set account preserved in the Jinsa Rabba contains cosmological narratives that parallel Mesopotamian creation myths, including references to primordial waters, divine assemblies, and the creation of humanity for divine service. The text description of the Utres, divine beings who govern different aspects of the cosmos, reflects clear structural similarities to Anunnaki hierarchies, while adapting these concepts to serve Mandan theological requirements, emphasizing spiritual salvation and esoteric knowledge. Mandan ritual practices preserve technical terminology and procedural details that derive from ancient Mesopotamian temple liturgies, though adapted to serve different theological purposes. The massacre ceremony performed to ensure the spiritual ascent of deceased souls involved ritual procedures that paralleled ancient Mesopotamian practices while incorporating elements that reflected later Gnostic influences. The priest's use of specific incantations and ritual gestures during these ceremonies preserved traditional techniques for divine communication that had originally developed within Anunnaki temple complexes, demonstrating remarkable continuity across more than a millennium of cultural and political transformation. The preservation of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge within Islamic scholarly circles represented another crucial channel through which Anunnaki-related concepts reached medieval audiences. The translation movement that flourished in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries CE brought together scholars from diverse cultural backgrounds who collaborated to render Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit scientific texts into Arabic while also accessing indigenous Mesopotamian sources that had survived in various forms. The Banu Musa brothers, working under Abbasid patronage during the 9th century, produced translations of astronomical works that preserved Babylonian star, names, and constellation mythology, ensuring that traditional Anunnaki associations with celestial phenomena would continue to influence Islamic astronomical literature. The great astronomer Al-Battani, working in northern Mesopotamia during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, exemplified the sophisticated synthesis of diverse astronomical traditions that characterized Islamic scientific culture. His Jal Sabi contained star catalogues that preserved Babylonian stellar nomenclature alongside Greek constellation names and Arabic observational data, creating comprehensive reference works that maintained continuity with ancient traditions while advancing contemporary scientific knowledge. His computational methods for calculating planetary positions incorporated techniques that ultimately derived from Babylonian mathematical astronomy. Though adapted and refined through centuries of scholarly development, the Haranian community at ancient Haran represented a remarkable example of direct religious continuity with ancient Mesopotamian traditions, maintaining temple worship and philosophical schools that preserved elements of traditional planetary theology. Well into the Islamic period, these scholars, who identified themselves as Sabians to gain recognition as a legitimate religious community under Islamic law, maintained sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge that they claimed derived from ancient Mesopotamian wisdom traditions. Their temple complex housed libraries containing texts in multiple languages that preserve traditional knowledge about planetary influences and divine hierarchies. Though adapted to conform with monotheistic requirements imposed by Islamic political authority, the influence of Iranian scholars on medieval Islamic intellectual culture extended far beyond their small religious community through their roles as translators, astronomers, and court advisors who brought ancient Mesopotamian knowledge into contact with contemporary scientific and philosophical developments. The Vibid Ibn Qura, the most famous Iranian scholar, of the 9th century, produced translations of mathematical and astronomical texts that preserve traditional computational methods while also contributing original research that advanced contemporary understanding of planetary motion and mathematical theory. His work on the precession of the equinoxes incorporated observational data that derived ultimately from Babylonian astronomical records, demonstrating how ancient knowledge could contribute to contemporary scientific advancement. The preservation of Mesopotamian medical knowledge within Islamic scholarly circles created another channel through which traditional wisdom associated with Anunnaki temple medicine reached medieval audiences. The translation of Greek medical texts that incorporated earlier Mesopotamian pharmaceutical knowledge ensured that traditional remedies and diagnostic techniques would continue to influence medical practice throughout the Islamic tech world. The works of Hunayn and other translators preserve detailed knowledge of plant-based medicines and surgical procedures that had originally developed within temple medical schools, though adapted to serve the needs of Islamic urban populations rather than traditional religious communities. The magical and astrological traditions that emerged within medieval Islamic culture incorporated significant elements derived from ancient Mesopotamian religious practices, though transformed to serve individual rather than communal purposes. The Gayat al-Hakim attributed to the Cordoban scholar Maslama al-Majriti contained detailed instructions for invoking planetary spirits that showed clear relationships to traditional Anunnaki worship, including specific ritual procedures and incantations that preserved ancient terminology and symbolic associations. These magical texts treated traditional deities as powerful spiritual entities that could be contacted through appropriate ritual procedures, maintaining essential elements of ancient religious practice while adapting them to serve private rather than public purposes. The influence of Mesopotamian astrological traditions on medieval, Islamic, and Christian cultures operated through multiple channels that preserve different aspects of traditional knowledge according to their specific cultural requirements. The Kitab al-Uluf by Abu Masha al-Bali incorporated extensive material derived from Babylonian astrological sources, including detailed descriptions of planetary influences and predictive techniques that maintain traditional associations between celestial phenomena and earthly events. His work influenced both Islamic and Latin astrological traditions, ensuring that Mesopotamian concepts would continue to shape medieval understanding of cosmic influences on human affairs. The transmission of Mesopotamian flood narratives through Jewish and Christian literary traditions created additional channels through which Anunnaki-related concepts reached medieval audiences, though significantly transformed to conform with monotheistic theological requirements. The Book of Enoch, composed during the Second Temple period, but preserved in various medieval manuscripts, contains detailed accounts of divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity various arts and sciences, clearly reflecting influence from traditional Anunnaki mythology, while adapting these narratives to serve Jewish apocalyptic theology. The text's description of the Watchers and their interactions with humanity preserved structural elements of ancient Mesopotamian divine-human relationships, while transforming their theological significance. Medieval Christian chronographic traditions preserved fragments of Mesopotamian historical and mythological narratives through their incorporation of material derived ultimately from Berosus and other Hellenistic sources that had attempted to present Babylonian traditions to Greek audiences. The Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, composed during the 12th century, contained references to antediluvian rulers and divine beings that reflected traditional Mesopotamian king lists and mythological narratives. Though interpreted within Christian theological frameworks that emphasize divine providence and human salvation, these chronographic works preserve traditional chronological data and narrative structures while adapting them to serve Christian historical and theological purposes. Part 11. The influence of Mesopotamian architectural and artistic traditions on medieval Islamic, religious, and secular buildings created visual channels through which traditional symbolic associations continued to influence cultural expression. The use of step tower designs in medieval Islamic architecture reflected influence from ancient ziggurat construction, while decorative programs that incorporated astronomical and astrological imagery maintained traditional associations between architectural space and cosmic order. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, constructed during the late 7th century, featured decorative elements that showed clear influence from earlier Mesopotamian artistic traditions, including geometric patterns and celestial imagery that preserved traditional symbolic associations while serving new religious purposes. The preservation of Mesopotamian mathematical knowledge within medieval Islamic scholarly circles ensured that computational techniques originally developed for temple administration and astronomical calculation would continue to influence scientific and commercial practice throughout the medieval period. The works of Al-Khwarizmi and other early Islamic mathematicians incorporated methods that derived ultimately from Babylonian mathematical texts, including sophisticated techniques for solving quadratic equations and calculating compound interest that had originally developed to serve temple economic administration. These mathematical traditions maintained continuity with ancient scholarly practices while adapting them to serve the needs of medieval Islamic urban civilization. The influence of Mesopotamian legal traditions on medieval Islamic jurisprudence operated through complex channels that preserved certain procedural and conceptual elements while transforming their theological and social significance. The development of Islamic commercial law incorporated principles that showed clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian legal traditions, including sophisticated approaches to contract formation, dispute resolution, and commercial partnership that had originally developed within temple-centered economic systems. These legal traditions maintained practical continuity with ancient commercial practices while adapting them to serve the needs of medieval Islamic trading networks. The mystical traditions that emerged within medieval Islamic culture incorporated elements that showed clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian religious practices, particularly in their approaches to divine communication and spiritual transformation. The works of Sufi authors like Ibn Arabi contained cosmological speculations that reflected influence from traditional Mesopotamian theological concepts, including detailed descriptions of divine hierarchies and cosmic structure that preserved essential elements of ancient religious thought while adapting them to serve Islamic mystical purposes. These mystical traditions maintained continuity with ancient approaches to divine knowledge while transforming their practical and theological applications. The preservation of Mesopotamian agricultural and technical knowledge within medieval Islamic civilization ensured that practical wisdom, originally developed within temple-centered economic systems, would continue to influence rural and urban life throughout the medieval period. Agricultural manuals produced by Islamic scholars incorporated techniques for irrigation management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding that derived ultimately from Mesopotamian agricultural traditions, though adapted to serve different environmental and social conditions. These technical traditions maintained practical continuity with ancient knowledge while demonstrating their continued relevance for medieval agricultural and urban development. The influence of Mesopotamian musical and liturgical traditions on medieval religious practices created additional channels through which ancient cultural elements reached contemporary audiences, though significantly transformed to serve new religious and social purposes. The development of Islamic liturgical music incorporated modal systems and performance techniques that showed relationships to earlier Mesopotamian temple music, while Christian liturgical traditions in the region preserved certain melodic and rhythmic patterns that reflected continuity with ancient religious practices. These musical traditions maintained aesthetic and practical continuity with ancient cultural forms while adapting them to serve medieval religious and social requirements. The systematic recovery of Anunnaki source materials began with the monumental breakthrough achieved by Georg Friedrich Groton in 1802, when the German philologists successfully deciphered the first cuneiform characters from Old Persian inscriptions at Pepelalis. Working with copies of trilingual inscriptions that included Old Persian, Eliliumite, and Babylonian versions of the same royal proclamations, Grothendieck applied comparative linguistic methods to identify recurring royal names and titles, establishing the foundation for all subsequent uniform studies. His initial success with Old Persian provided the key to unlocking Odeon and eventually Sumerian, opening access to the vast corpus of Mesopotamian literature that had remained silent for over a millennium. The decipherment process accelerated dramatically through the competitive efforts of Henry Rawlinson, who spent years suspended on ropes copying the massive trilingual inscription set of Darius, the first carved into the cliff face at Behistun in western Iran. Rawlinson's meticulous work during the 1840s provided scholars with extensive bilingual texts that enabled systematic comparison between known Old Persian words and their Odeon equivalents. His publication of accurate copies of the Behest inscription in 1851 gave European scholars the extensive parallel texts necessary for Corney, necessary for establishing grammatical rules and vocabulary lists that would make possible the reading of, quote, monolingual Akkadian and Sumerian texts. The British Museum's acquisition of Austin Henry Layard's discoveries from Nineveh transformed European understanding of ancient Mesopotamian civilization and provided the first substantial collection of uniform tablets containing mythological and religious texts. Layard's excavations at Kyanjik, the site of ancient Nineveh between 1845 and 1851, uncovered the palace library of Ashurbanipal, containing over 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments that represented the most comprehensive collection of Mesopotamian literature ever assembled in antiquity. The library's systematic organization with texts arranged by subject matter and cross-referenced through detailed catalogues provided modern scholars with unprecedented access to the full range of Mesopotamian intellectual achievement. George Smith's dramatic announcement in 1872 that he had discovered an account of the biblical flood among the Nineveh tablets created an international sensation and demonstrated the immediate relevance of uniform studies for understanding ancient history and religious traditions. Smith's identification of the flood narrative within what would later be recognized as the Epic of Gilgamesh marked the first recovery of a complete Anunnaki-related mythological composition, providing concrete evidence for these sophisticated theological and literary traditions that had developed in ancient Mesopotamia. His public lecture to the Society of Biblical Archaeology drew overflow crowds and newspaper coverage that brought uniform scholarship to popular attention for the first time. The subsequent identification of multiple flood accounts, including the more complete version preserved in the Atraces epic, revealed the central importance of divine judgment narratives within Mesopotamian religious thought and provided scholars with detailed information about Anunnaki theology and cosmic governance. Smith's continued work on the Nineveh tablets yielded additional mythological compositions, including creation accounts and divine genealogies that illuminated the complex relationships between different members of the Anunnaki pantheon. His premature death in 1876, while searching for additional flood tablet fragments in Syria, represented a significant loss to the emerging field of Assyriology. But his discoveries had already established the fundamental importance of Mesopotamian literature for understanding ancient religious and cultural development. The German excavations at Babylon, initiated by Robert Coldy in 1899 and continuing for 18 years, provided the first systematic archaeological investigation of a major Mesopotamian religious center, yielded extensive architectural and textual evidence for Anunnaki worship practices. Coldway's meticulous documentation of the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the foundations of the great Ziggurat Itani revealed the massive scale of resources devoted to divine service and the sophisticated engineering techniques employed in temple construction. The excavation's recovery of thousands of ununiform tablets from residential and commercial contexts demonstrated how deeply religious concepts penetrated daily life in Babylonian society. The discovery of the Enuma Elish creation, epic among the Babylon tablets, provided scholars with the most comprehensive account of Marduk's rise to supreme authority within the Anunnaki hierarchy and revealed the sophisticated theological arguments that Babylonian scholars had developed to justify their city's political dominance. The epic's detailed description of primordial chaos, divine conflict, and cosmic organization offered unprecedented insight into Mesopotamian cosmological thinking while demonstrating the literary sophistication that characterized mature Babylonian religious composition. The text's 7 tablets each containing approximately 150 lines of carefully structured poetry, represented one of the longest and most complex literary works recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley's excavations at between 1922 and 1934 revolutionized understanding of early Mesopotamian civilization and provided dramatic evidence for the wealth and sophistication of Sumerian religious institutions. The discovery of the royal cemetery, with its elaborate burial goods and evidence for human sacrifice. Accompanying royal interments demonstrated the extraordinary resources that early Mesopotamian societies devoted to ensuring proper relationships between earthly rulers and divine authorities. The cemetery's most spectacular find, the burial of Queen Prabi with her full retinue of attendants, revealed the extent to which Sumerian concepts of divine kingship required elaborate, ritual procedures that maintained cosmic order through royal death and resurrection. Woolley's identification of flood deposits at multiple levels within the excavation provided archaeological evidence that supported the historical basis for Mesopotamian flood narratives, though the localized nature of these deposits indicated that the Great Flood reflected regional rather than global catastrophic events. The excavation's recovery of votive objects, cylinder seals, and architectural remains from the early dynastic period illuminated the development of Sumerian religious art and temple architecture. Ununiform tablets from later periods documented the continued importance of as a center for lunar worship and astronomical observation throughout Mesopotamian history. The joint expedition to Nippur, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania and other institutions beginning in 1888, provided the first systematic exploration of Mesopotamia's most important religious center and yielded the largest collection of Sumerian literary and religious texts ever discovered. The excavation of the Enlil temple complex revealed the architectural evolution of Mesopotamian religious construction over more than 3 millennia, while the recovery of over 50,000 ununiform tablets and fragments from the temple archives provided unprecedented documentation of Sumerian religious practices, administrative procedures, and literary traditions. Samuel Noah Kramer's lifelong dedication to translating and interpreting the Nippur tablets revolutionized scholarly understanding of Sumerian civilization and established the fundamental importance of Sumerian religious thought for all subsequent Mesopotamian cultural development. Kramer's identification of numerous firsts in human civilization among the Sumerian texts, including the first literary compositions, the first historical records, and the first systematic theological speculation, demonstrated the foundational role that Sumerian culture had played in human intellectual development. His translation of Sumerian hymns, myths, and epic narratives revealed the sophisticated literary techniques and complex theological concepts that characterized mature Sumerian religious thought. Kramer's work on Sumerian creation myths, including the composition known as the debate between grain and sheep, illuminated the practical concerns that underlay Mesopotamian theological speculation and demonstrated how religious narratives served to explain and justify the agricultural and pastoral activities that sustained urban civilization. His translation of texts describing the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi provided detailed information about ritual practices that renewed divine authority and ensured agricultural fertility, while his work on Sumerian flood narratives revealed the theological tensions that had led to divine decisions to destroy and recreate human civilization. Thoril Jacobson's comparative analysis of Mesopotamian religious development provided the theoretical framework that enabled scholars to understand the evolution of Anunnaki theology from its earliest Sumerian origins through its final transformation during the Hellenistic period. Jacobson's identification of distinct phases in Mesopotamian religious thought, from the early democracy of the Fa gods through the later emphasis on individual divine supremacy, explained how changing political and social conditions had influenced theological development while maintaining essential continuity in basic religious concepts. Jacobson's detailed analysis of Mesopotamian creation myths revealed the sophisticated political metaphors that underlay apparently simple mythological narratives, demonstrating how stories about divine conflicts and cosmic organization reflected contemporary concerns about earthly governance and social order. His work on the Atrahasis epic illuminated the economic and demographic pressures that had shaped Mesopotamian thinking about divine human relationships. while his analysis of the Enuma Elish revealed the theological innovations that had enabled Babylonian scholars to adapt traditional religious concepts to serve imperial political requirements. The discovery of the library at Sultanep in southeastern Turkey during excavations conducted by Satan Lloyd and Nuri Guke in the 1950s provided scholars with additional copies of major Mesopotamian literary works and revealed the extent to which traditional religious texts had been preserved and studied in provincial centers throughout the Assyrian Empire. The library's collection of canonical literary works, including multiple copies of the Gilgamesh epic and various Anunnaki hymns, demonstrated the systematic efforts that Assyrian scholars had made to preserve and standardize Mesopotamian religious literature. The Sultanate tablets included commentaries and scholarly analyses of classical texts that reveal the sophisticated interpretive techniques that ancient scholars had developed for understanding complex mythological and theological concepts. These commentaries provided modern scholars with ancient explanations of obscure references and technical terminology, enabling more accurate translation and interpretation of difficult passages in major literary works. The library's preservation of both canonical texts and scholarly commentaries demonstrated the continuity of intellectual tradition that had maintained Mesopotamian religious and literary culture across multiple centuries of political upheaval. French excavations at Mari, conducted by André Parrot, beginning in 1933, uncovered a major administrative center from the old Babylonian period and provided extensive documentation of religious practices and political relationships during a crucial period of Mesopotamian history. The palace archives at Mari contained over 25,000 ununiform tablets that documented diplomatic correspondence, administrative procedures, and religious activities that illuminated the practical operation of divine kingship and temple administration during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The Mari letters included detailed accounts of prophetic activities and divine communication that reveal how Mesopotamian rulers maintained relationships with patron deities and sought divine guidance for political and military decisions. These texts provided concrete evidence for the practical operation of theological concepts that had previously been known primarily through literary and mythological sources, demonstrating how beliefs about divine authority translated into actual political and administrative procedures. The recovery of Odeon literary texts from various sites throughout Mesopotamia enabled scholars to trace the development of Anunnaki mythology through different periods and regions, revealing both continuity and innovation in religious thought across more than 2 millennia. The identification of multiple versions of major compositions, including various versions of the Gilgamesh epic and different traditions regarding creation and flood narratives, demonstrated the dynamic character of Mesopotamian religious literature and the ongoing efforts that ancient scholars had made to adapt traditional stories to contemporary concerns. Archaeological investigations at Eridu, conducted by Fuad Safar and Satan Lloyd during the 1940s and 1950s, provided crucial evidence for the for the earliest development of Mesopotamian religious architecture and confirmed the site's traditional identification as the first city established by the gods. The excavation revealed 17 successive temple levels dating from the Ubaid period through the Neo-Ablonian era, documenting the continuous religious significance of the site over more than 4 millennia. The earliest temple levels showed sophisticated architectural planning that established design principles later adopted throughout Mesopotamia, while votive objects and architectural features demonstrated the early development of religious concepts that would later be elaborated in complex theological systems. The continuing discovery and publication of ununiform texts from museum collections and new excavations has provided scholars with an ever-expanding corpus of primary sources for understanding Anunnaki theology and Mesopotamian religious practices. Major text editions, including the ongoing Chicago Assyrian Dictionary Project and the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, have made possible increasingly sophisticated analysis of religious terminology and theological concepts, while improved understanding of Mesopotamian historical development has enabled more accurate contextualization of religious texts within their original cultural and political settings. Modern archaeological techniques, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic surface survey, have identified hundreds of previously unknown Mesopotamian sites, and provided new opportunities for understanding the geographical distribution and regional variation of Anunnaki worship. These technological advances have enabled archaeologists to investigate sites that were previously inaccessible while minimizing damage to fragile archaeological remains, ensuring that future generations of scholars will have access to well-preserved evidence for understanding ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The integration of archaeological evidence with textual sources has created increasingly sophisticated understanding of how Anunnaki theology developed within specific historical and cultural contexts, while comparative analysis with other ancient Near Eastern religious traditions has illuminated the distinctive characteristics of Mesopotamian religious thought. This multidisciplinary approach has revealed the complexity and sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while demonstrating its fundamental importance for understanding the development of human religious and intellectual culture. The systematic recovery of Mesopotamian textual and archaeological evidence throughout the 19th and 20th centuries established a solid academic foundation for understanding the historical role of the Anunnaki within ancient Near Eastern civilization. Contemporary scholarly consensus recognizes these deities as central figures in the world's earliest urban religious systems, representing sophisticated theological concepts that governed cosmic order, political legitimacy, and social organization throughout 3 millennia of Mesopotamian history. Leading archaeologists, including Jeremy Black, Andrew George, and Mark Vannerup, have demonstrated through careful textual analysis and archaeological correlation that the Anunnaki functioned as administrative deities whose authority encompassed both celestial phenomena and terrestrial governance, creating integrated systems of divine kingship that sustained the world's first complex urban societies. Modern academic interpretation emphasizes the Anunnakis' role as patron deities of specific city-states, with individual gods like Enlil at Nepo, Marduk at Babylon, and Inanna at Uruk, serving as divine rulers whose earthly temples functioned as comprehensive administrative centers managing agricultural production, craft specialization, and long-distance trade networks. Archaeological evidence from sites like Jeru, Nippur, and reveals the massive economic infrastructure required to support these religious institutions, with temple complexes employing thousands of workers and controlling vast agricultural estates that generated the surplus wealth necessary for monumental construction projects and elaborate ritual cycles. The theological sophistication of Anunnaki worship emerges clearly from comparative analysis of creation myths, flood narratives, and divine genealogies preserved in cuneiform literature spanning from early dynastic Sumerian compositions through Neo-Babylonian scholarly commentaries. These texts reveal systematic theological thinking that addressed fundamental questions about cosmic origins, divine authority, human purpose, and moral order through complex mythological narratives that served both religious and political functions within Mesopotamian society. The Atraces epic's account of human creation as divine laborers. The Enuma Elish's justification of Babylonian political supremacy through Marduk's cosmic victory, and the various flood narratives' exploration of divine justice demonstrate the intellectual rigor that characterized mature Mesopotamian religious thought. Academic research has also illuminated the historical development of Anunnaki theology through successive periods of political and cultural change, revealing how these religious concepts adapted to serve different social needs while maintaining essential continuity across millennia of historical transformation. The evolution from early Sumerian concepts of divine democracy through late Babylonian emphasis on monarchical divine authority reflects changing political realities, while the integration of foreign deities into traditional Anunnaki hierarchies during periods of cultural contact demonstrates the flexibility that enabled these religious traditions to survive conquest and demographic change. However, the academic understanding of the Anunnaki as historical religious phenomena has been overshadowed in popular culture by alternative interpretations that treat these deities as extraterrestrial visitors who influenced early human civilization through advanced technology and genetic manipulation. These theories, popularized primarily through the works of authors like Zecharia Sitchin, Erich von Däniken, and more recently, the Ancient Aliens television set. Programming proposed that Sumerian texts describing divine activities should be understood as literal accounts of alien intervention rather than mythological narratives expressing religious and political concepts. Seitin's translation and interpretation of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, beginning with his 1976 publication. The 12th planet claimed to reveal evidence for an additional planet called Nibiru, whose inhabitants, the Anunnaki, traveled to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold needed for their home planet's atmospheric maintenance. According to Sitchin's interpretation, these extraterrestrial beings genetically modified existing human species to create modern humans as a slave labor force, establishing the first human civilizations in Mesopotamia before departing Earth with promises to return during future planetary alignments. Sitchin's theories gained substantial popular following through their presentation in accessible language that promised to reveal hidden truths about human origins while explaining the rapid development of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. His interpretation of Kuneoifa texts emphasized passages describing divine beings descending from heaven, teaching humans various technologies and possessing powers that seem to exceed normal human capabilities. The author's background in economics and journalism, combined with his claimed expertise in ancient languages, lent apparent credibility to his interpretations among audiences lacking specialized knowledge of Mesopotamian studies. The ancient astronaut hypothesis expanded beyond Sitchin's specific interpretations through the work of authors like von Daniken, whose Chariots of the Gods proposed that various ancient monuments and artifacts worldwide provided evidence for extraterrestrial visitation. Von Daniken's approach emphasized visual evidence, including architectural achievements that seemed to exceed ancient technological capabilities, artistic representations that resembled modern aircraft or astronauts, and mythological narratives from multiple cultures describing divine beings with advanced powers and technologies. The popularity of these alternative theories reflects broader cultural fascination with extraterrestrial life and dissatisfaction with conventional academic explanations for the rapid development of human civilization during the Neolithic Revolution. The ancient astronaut hypothesis offers seemingly simple solutions to complex historical questions while appealing to contemporary scientific concepts about space travel and genetic engineering that make alien intervention appear plausible within modern technological frameworks. Professional archaeologists and archaeologists have consistently rejected these alternative interpretations through detailed analysis of the linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence that contradicts extraterrestrial visitation theories. Michael Heiser's comprehensive critique of Sitchin's translations in The Unseen Realm demonstrates numerous errors in uniform reading and interpretation that undermine the foundation for ancient astronaut claims. While Irving Finkel's analysis of Mesopotamian flood narratives in the Ark before Noah reveals the complex literary and theological development that produced these compositions over centuries of cultural evolution. The archaeological record provides no evidence for the advanced technologies that would have been necessary for interplanetary travel during ancient periods, while the gradual development of Mesopotamian civilization through successive cultural phases contradicts claims about sudden technological advancement through alien intervention. Excavations at sites like Teleson, Chomarami, and early Uruk reveal the incremental development of agricultural techniques, craft specialization, and urban organization that produced the complex societies documented in later historical periods. Despite academic rejection, ancient astronaut theories have profoundly influenced popular culture through their incorporation into science fiction, literature, television programming, and internet-based alternative history communities. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series, which has produced over 200 episodes since 2009, presents these theories as legitimate scientific hypotheses worthy of serious consideration. Featuring interviews with proponents alongside dramatic reenactments and computer-generated imagery that creates compelling visual narratives supporting extraterrestrial interpretation of ancient evidence. The series format typically presents conventional archaeological and historical evidence, alongside alternative interpretations that emphasize unexplained aspects of ancient achievements, creating false equivalences between established scholarly consensus and speculative theories lacking empirical support. This presentation strategy appeals to audiences skeptical of academic authority while satisfying entertainment. Preferences for dramatic narratives that promise revolutionary revelations about human history and cosmic significance. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary literature and speculative fiction extends far beyond ancient astronaut theories through their incorporation into fantasy and science fiction narratives that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian mythology. While adapting these concepts to serve modern storytelling purposes, authors like Neil Gaiman in American Gods and Kim Stanley Robinson in The Years of Rice and Salt have incorporated Mesopotamian deities into complex narratives exploring themes of cultural change, religious evolution, and human adaptation to technological advancement. The video game industry has particularly embraced Mesopotamian mythological concepts through games like Assassin's Creed and Civilization that allow players to interact with historical civilizations while incorporating fantastical elements derived from ancient religious traditions. These interactive media create immersive experiences that introduce players to Mesopotamian cultural concepts while transforming them into entertainment content that may bear little resemblance to their original historical contexts. Contemporary neopagan and reconstructionist religious movements have attempted to revive authentic Mesopotamian religious practices through careful study of cuneiform for sources and archaeological evidence, creating modern religious communities that honor traditional Anunnaki while adapting ancient practices to contemporary social and legal contexts. The Mesopotamian reconstructionist movement, though relatively small, includes practitioners who have learned cuneiform script, studied ancient ritual procedures, and created modern adaptations of traditional ceremonies that maintain theological continuity with ancient practices. These contemporary practitioners face significant challenges in reconstructing authentic ancient religious practices from incomplete textual and archaeological sources, while also adapting traditions developed for ancient urban temple communities to serve the needs of modern individuals and small groups. The absence of continuous traditional transmission requires modern practitioners to rely on scholarly interpretations of ancient sources, creating religious practices that may differ substantially from their ancient predecessors despite sincere attempts at historical accuracy. The Sumerian Mesopotamian Orthodox Temple movement, established by practitioners seeking to create authentic reconstructions of ancient religious traditions, has developed ritual practices based on careful study of uniform liturgical texts and archaeological evidence for temple procedures. These groups typically emphasize historical accuracy over contemporary spiritual needs, creating religious practices that prioritize authenticity to ancient sources. Even when this creates practical difficulties for modern practitioners, other contemporary groups have adopted more flexible approaches that honor Mesopotamian deities while incorporating modern spiritual concepts and practices that address contemporary religious needs. These syncretic movements may combine Anunnaki worship with elements from other ancient traditions, modern witchcraft practices, or New Age spirituality, creating religious systems that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian sources while serving the spiritual needs of modern practitioners. The academic study of these contemporary religious movements has revealed the complex relationship between historical scholarship and modern spiritual practice, with reconstructionist groups serving as both consumers and critics of academic research on ancient Mesopotamian religion. These practitioners often possess sophisticated knowledge of ununiform sources and archaeological evidence that enables them to engage critically with scholarly interpretations while developing their own understanding of ancient religious concepts and practices. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary culture extends beyond explicit religious or alternative history movements through their incorporation into broader cultural narratives about human origins, technological development, and cosmic significance. The themes of divine creation, technological advancement, and moral judgment that characterize Mesopotamian mythology continue to resonate with modern audiences through their appearance in science fiction, fantasy literature, and popular philosophy that addresses fundamental questions about human nature and destiny. The digital age has created new opportunities for preserving and disseminating knowledge about Anunnaki traditions through online databases, digital archives, and interactive educational resources that make ununiform texts and archaeological evidence accessible to global audiences. Projects like the Ununiform Digital Library Initiative and the Open, Richly Annotated Ununiform Corpus provide scholars and interested individuals with access to thousands of primary sources that were previously available only to specialists with access to major research libraries. These digital resources have democratized access to Mesopotamian source materials, while also creating new challenges for distinguishing between accurate scholarly information and alternative interpretations that may lack empirical support. The Internet's capacity for rapid information dissemination has enabled both academic research and pseudoscientific theories to reach global audiences, simultaneously requiring users to develop critical evaluation skills for assessing the reliability of different sources and interpretations. The contemporary legacy of Anunnaki traditions thus encompasses multiple parallel streams of interpretation and application that serve different cultural functions within modern society. Academic scholarship continues to refine understanding of these deities' historical roles within ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while alternative theories provide entertainment and speculative frameworks for understanding human origins. Religious reconstructionist movements attempt to revive authentic ancient practices, while popular culture adapts Mesopotamian concepts to serve contemporary storytelling and spiritual needs. The enduring appeal of Anunnaki concepts across these diverse contemporary applications demonstrates the fundamental importance of the questions that these ancient traditions addressed regarding cosmic order, divine authority, human purpose, and moral responsibility. Whether approached as historical phenomena worthy of scholarly investigation, extraterrestrial visitors offering solutions to cosmic mysteries, or divine beings deserving contemporary worship, the Anunnaki continue to provide frameworks for understanding humanity's place within larger cosmic and historical contexts. The scholarly consensus regarding the Anunnaki as sophisticated theological concepts developed within the world's earliest urban civilizations provides the most reliable foundation for understanding their historical significance and continuing relevance. These deities represented humanity's first systematic attempts to understand cosmic order, political authority, and moral responsibility through complex mythological narratives that integrated religious, political, and practical concerns within comprehensive worldviews that sustained urban civilization for over 3 millennia. The preservation of Anunnaki traditions through ununiform literature and archaeological remains ensures that these ancient concepts will continue to influence human understanding of religious, political, and cultural development, regardless of how contemporary interpreters choose to understand their ultimate significance. The careful work of scholars who have recovered, translated, and interpreted these sources provide future generations with access to humanity's earliest systematic theological and philosophical thinking, demonstrating both the continuity and creativity that have characterized human intellectual development throughout recorded history. The Anunnakis' journey from active deities governing ancient Mesopotamian city-states to subjects of contemporary academic study, popular speculation, and religious revival illustrates the complex processes through which ancient cultural traditions adapt to serve new social and intellectual needs while maintaining essential continuity with their historical origins. Their continuing presence in modern discourse, whether through scholarly analysis, alternative theories, or contemporary religious practice, testifies to the enduring power of the fundamental questions about human existence, cosmic order, and divine authority that these ancient traditions first systematically addressed over 5,000 years ago.